They sailed into battle knowing they were outgunned, outnumbered and doomed. But still, they fought until the sea swallowed them whole. It was February 1942, and the waters of the Java Sea shimmered deceptively calm under the tropical sun. Beneath that surface calm, however, the Pacific was on fire. Only weeks earlier, Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia with terrifying speed. Malaya and Singapore had fallen, the Philippines were collapsing, and the once proud Western colonial powers found themselves reeling. Now, the Dutch East Indies, rich in oil, tin and rubber, stood as Japan's next prize. Whoever controlled these waters would control the resources that fueled empires, and both sides knew the stakes. For the Allies, it was desperation. The hastily formed American-British-Dutch-Australian Command, known as ABDA, was a patchwork coalition of navies and air forces thrown together to stop Japan's advance. They came from different nations, spoke different languages, and often had never fought side by side before. Their ships were old, their coordination thin, and their resources stretched beyond breaking. Yet in late February 1942, this outmatched force sailed out to confront the Imperial Japanese Navy in what would become one of the largest and most chaotic naval battles of the Second World War. For the Japanese, the Battle of the Java Sea was another step in their grand strategy of expansion. Their fleets were modern, their aircraft plentiful, their crews highly trained, and their confidence soaring after months of unbroken victories. To them, the Allied flotilla waiting in the Java Sea was little more than an obstacle, a fragile line of outdated cruisers and destroyers standing between them and the riches of the Dutch East Indies. But in warfare, even the smallest obstacle can become a desperate fight, and the Allies were determined to resist. The clash that followed was brutal, chaotic, and tragic. For 7 long hours, shells and torpedoes tore across the waters. Smoke rose from burning ships, crews scrambled to keep their vessels afloat, and communication between the multinational Allied forces often broke down at the worst possible moments. The Dutch flagship Narrated and her brave Admiral Doorman would not survive the encounter, nor would many of the ships under his command. One by one, the Allied fleet was destroyed or scattered, their sacrifice marking the beginning of the end for Allied presence in the Dutch East Indies. But beyond the tactical defeat lay a deeper story of courage and hopelessness, of men who fought, knowing they were sailing into near-certain destruction, and of the human cost of coalition warfare when the odds were stacked against them. The Battle of the Java Sea was not just about ships and strategy. It was about sailors fighting for one another, about nations learning the harsh lessons of modern naval warfare, and about how one defeat could reshape the balance of an entire region. Tonight, we will tell that story in full. From the collapse of Allied positions across Asia, to the desperate last stand in the Java Sea, to the human voices of those who lived and those who died in one of the Pacific War's most tragic naval battles. And before we begin, I want to ask you, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? I love seeing how people from all over the world come together in this community, tuning in at dawn in the middle of their workday, or late at night before drifting off to sleep. So settle in, relax, and join me as we relive the entire history of the Battle of the Java Sea, the doomed Allied stand against the unstoppable tide of Japan in the Pacific War. The dawn of 1942 in the Pacific was marked by uncertainty, fear, and rapid transformation. Just weeks earlier, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the illusion of American invulnerability and thrust the United States into global war. Across Asia and the Pacific, Japanese forces advanced with breathtaking speed, striking with precision at territories long held by Western colonial powers. Malaya and Singapore, bastions of British influence, faced relentless bombardment from air and sea. The Philippines, defended by American and Filipino troops, became a desperate battlefield as Japanese divisions pushed inland. In the Netherlands East Indies, oil-rich and strategically vital, local defenders braced for an invasion they knew was inevitable. Each new Japanese victory underscored the weakness of Allied coordination in the region, as diverse national forces struggled to unify. This was not a war fought in distant lands, but in the very heart of vital sea lanes and colonies. The Pacific in early 1942 was a stage set for confrontation where naval power would determine the fate of empires, and into this cauldron the Dutch East Indies stood as both prize and trap, awaiting its turn under the shadow of the rising sun. The shock of Pearl Harbor reverberated far beyond the Hawaiian Islands. Naval planners in Washington, London, Canberra and Batavia scrambled to adapt to a new reality where the Imperial Japanese Navy held the initiative. Once viewed as a distant threat, Japan had revealed its ability to coordinate large-scale strikes, cripple major fleets, and project power across thousands of miles. The attack demonstrated the dominance of aircraft carriers over traditional battleships, a lesson still sinking in for many Allied commanders. Japan's immediate thrusts into Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong further emphasized its sweeping ambition. Every victory brought with it the capture of valuable bases, airfields, and supply points to fuel further expansion. For the Allies, the psychological blow was as damaging as the military one. Soldiers and civilians alike began to see Japan as an unstoppable force, fueled by discipline, modern technology, and ruthless efficiency. This perception fed a sense of desperation that permeated the planning of defensive operations. In this environment of fear and uncertainty, the Dutch East Indies became the next great battlefield. The geography of Southeast Asia amplified the peril facing the Allies. Stretching across vast archipelagos, the seas around the Dutch East Indies held the resources Japan coveted most: oil, rubber, and tin. Without control of these supplies, Japan's war machine would eventually grind to a halt. The islands themselves created a natural fortress, with narrow straits and channels that could either serve as barriers or highways for invasion. Yet defending such an immense area required naval and air forces the Allies simply did not possess. The fall of Malaya and Singapore created a gaping hole in the defensive line, exposing the southern approaches to the east. The Philippines struggled under siege, with American forces increasingly isolated and cut off. In Australia, military leaders feared their continent could be the next target if Japan pushed south. Thus, the Dutch East Indies became the final buffer, the last major position between Japan's advancing forces and Australia's northern shores. In early 1942, every mile of ocean, every harbour, and every small island mattered. The Battle of the Java Sea would emerge directly from this fragile geography and its high-stakes importance. For Japan, the timing of its offensive was no accident. Planners in Tokyo understood the West was unprepared for sudden, simultaneous attacks across such a vast front. Their strategy, born from necessity, sought to deliver knockout blows before the industrial might of the United States could mobilize. By January 1942, Japanese forces already occupied most of Southeast Asia, with their eyes firmly set on Java and Sumatra. To fuel their empire, they needed oil, and the Dutch East Indies possessed some of the richest reserves in the world. Japanese leadership calculated that if they could seize these territories quickly, they would gain both resources and a defensive perimeter stretching thousands of miles. Admiral Yamamoto and other naval architects of the war, believed this perimeter could shield Japan's conquests from Allied counterattacks. The speed of their victories gave credence to this belief, fostering overconfidence in Tokyo. Each success seemed to confirm the inevitability of Japanese dominance, but within that overconfidence lay the seeds of eventual miscalculation, for not all Allied forces would yield so easily. The Allied position in early 1942 was precarious, yet far from hopeless. Britain, though reeling from the fall of Singapore, remained determined to defend its colonies. Australia, facing its greatest existential threat, threw itself fully into the war, mobilizing every available ship, aircraft, and soldier. The United States, stunned by Pearl Harbor, had already begun the long process of reconstituting its Pacific Fleet. Even the small and beleaguered Netherlands government in exile, operating from London, refused to surrender its resource-rich colonies without a fight. Together, these powers formed the American-British-Dutch-Australian Command, or ABDA. It was a desperate coalition, riddled with communication difficulties and conflicting priorities, but it represented the Allies' only chance to stem the Japanese tide. In early February, ABDA began pooling naval resources, including cruisers and destroyers from 4 nations, to create a strike force capable of challenging Japanese advances. These ships, though outnumbered and outdated, carried with them the hopes of millions. The defense of the Dutch East Indies would test their resolve in ways no one fully anticipated. At the heart of this emerging struggle lay the Dutch East Indies itself. The colony, rich in oil fields and plantations, had been an integral part of the Netherlands' economy for centuries. Its capital, Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, served as both administrative hub and strategic prize. For local populations, the arrival of Japanese forces carried complex meanings. Some viewed the Japanese as potential liberators from colonial rule, unaware of the brutality that occupation would soon bring. For the Allies, however, there was no ambiguity. The Indies represented a critical lifeline for fuel and supplies. Without it, Japan could not sustain its expansion. With it, the Axis powers would gain a formidable foundation for their war effort. As Japanese troops closed in on Java from multiple directions, Allied commanders knew a decisive naval confrontation was inevitable. The battle that would soon erupt in the Java Sea was not merely about ships and sailors, it was about the control of a region that could tilt the balance of the entire Pacific War. The sense of inevitability grew heavier with each passing day of early 1942. Reports from the front lines painted a bleak picture. Japanese bombers ruled the skies, their warships prowled the seas, and their armies advanced with unrelenting momentum. In cities across Southeast Asia, civilians packed belongings, fearing the arrival of enemy troops. Allied sailors, boarding their ships in Surabaya or Cilacap, understood the odds stacked against them. Yet duty demanded they fight, even in the face of overwhelming superiority. Admiral Doorman, leading the Allied fleet, knew his mission was not simply to win, but to delay, to buy time for reinforcements that might never come. This looming confrontation carried an air of tragedy, for many sensed they were heading into a battle they could not survive. Nevertheless, they prepared their ships, loaded their guns, and steeled themselves for what lay ahead. The Java Sea awaited, a vast expanse where destiny and sacrifice would soon collide. In this crucible, the fate of nations and empires would be decided by steel, fire, and courage. As February 1942 unfolded, the stage was fully set. Japanese invasion fleets gathered with precision, protected by heavy cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers, their objectives clear and their confidence unshaken. On the other side, the Allies scraped together a coalition of ships from 4 different nations, commanded under a fragile framework of cooperation. They lacked unified communication systems, shared doctrine, and even compatible languages, but they shared one unbreakable determination to fight. The contrast between Japanese preparation and Allied desperation could not have been more stark. Yet history has often shown that battles are decided not only by strength, but also by resilience and chance. The coming clash in the Java Sea would embody that truth, delivering both disaster and heroism in equal measure. To understand the significance of this battle, one must begin here, in the fragile early months of 1942. It was a time when Japan's power seemed unstoppable, and the Allies' resistance seemed doomed. And yet, out of this desperate fight would come the first sparks of Allied defiance, flickering in the shadow of overwhelming darkness. The Dutch East Indies, stretching across thousands of islands in Southeast Asia, held a strategic value that few regions on Earth could rival in 1942. At its core lay oil, vast reserves that fueled the engines of modern war, powering tanks, aircraft, and ships. Japan, a resource-starved island nation, depended on imports to sustain its military expansion and industrial base. Before the war, much of Japan's oil came from the United States and Dutch colonies, a supply line abruptly severed by embargoes in 1941. Without oil, Japan's navy would be paralyzed, its air force grounded, and its mechanized army immobilized. Thus, securing the Dutch East Indies was not merely opportunistic, it was existential for Japan's war plans. Beyond oil, the region's plantations produced rubber, vital for tires, aircraft components, and countless military applications. Tin, bauxite, and other minerals essential for weapons production also flowed from these islands. The Dutch East Indies was more than a colony. It was a treasure chest of war resources, one the Japanese Empire intended to seize at all costs. The geography of the Dutch East Indies added another layer of importance to its resource wealth. Spanning from Sumatra in the west to New Guinea in the east, the islands formed a natural barrier along vital maritime routes. Whoever controlled these waters effectively controlled the sea lanes between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. For the Allies, this meant protecting supply lines to Australia and beyond, which were critical for launching any counter-offensive. For the Japanese, it meant creating a defensive shield around their newly conquered territories. By holding the Indies, Japan could both exploit resources and establish bases to project power across Southeast Asia. Airfields carved into the jungle could host bombers threatening northern Australia. Harbours could serve as staging points for fleets pushing deeper into the Pacific. The very map of the Dutch East Indies lent itself to both exploitation and domination. This combination of resources and geography made the region a magnet for Japanese ambition and a nightmare for Allied strategists. Oil lay at the heart of every Japanese calculation, and its urgency cannot be overstated. The island of Sumatra contained some of the largest reserves in Asia, with fields at Palembang already producing hundreds of thousands of tons annually. Refineries there process crude into aviation fuel, the lifeblood of carrier warfare and strategic bombing. Java too hosted wells and refineries that contributed to the flow of petroleum. With American and Dutch embargoes choking off access, Japan's war machine faced the prospect of collapse within a year if new supplies were not secured. This reality drove the strategic timetable for conquest, pushing Tokyo to strike south with breathtaking speed. Every Japanese aircraft carrier, cruiser and destroyer engaged in early 1942 was in essence a weapon sent to seize oil. Without it, their empire was unsustainable. With it, they could hope to fortify their perimeter and prolong the war. Oil was not simply a resource, It was the heartbeat of Japan's imperial gamble. At the Dutch East Indies, that gamble reached its highest stakes. Rubber provided another indispensable element of the Indies' strategic value. By 1940, nearly half of the world's rubber supply came from Southeast Asia, and its military applications were endless. Tires for trucks and aircraft, seals for engines, and insulation for communication cables all depended on rubber. Japan, like its Axis partner Germany, suffered from chronic shortages of this material. The plantations of Sumatra and Java offered a solution that no synthetic alternative could match at the time. Allied nations, particularly the United States, had long relied on these same plantations to keep their industries running. When Japan set its sights on the Indies, rubber became nearly as important as oil. The thought of Japanese aircraft fueled by Indonesian oil and rolling on rubber from the same islands alarmed Allied planners. To lose this supply to the enemy meant strengthening the very tools of conquest used against them. In this sense, rubber was as much a weapon of war as bombs and bullets, forged in the plantations of the tropics. Beyond oil and rubber, the Dutch East Indies offered a buffet of minerals that underpinned modern warfare. Bauxite from Borneo and Java was critical for producing aluminum, the lightweight metal essential for aircraft construction. Tin, mined extensively in Sumatra and surrounding islands, was necessary for manufacturing bronze alloys and electronics. Nickel, vital for strengthening steel, was also abundant in the region. Even coal deposits contributed to fueling local industries, though oil had by then become paramount. For Japan, securing these raw materials meant reducing dependence on distant supply chains, vulnerable to Allied interdiction. Every ton of ore shipped from the Indies to Japan represented planes built, ships armored, and weapons forged. In a war where industrial capacity often proved as decisive as battlefield bravery, these resources gave the Dutch East Indies disproportionate importance. The region was not simply a battlefield, it was an arsenal waiting to be claimed. Whoever controlled it could dictate the tempo and endurance of the Pacific War. Strategically, the Dutch East Indies represented more than resources. It was the pivot of Allied and Japanese planning. To the north lay the Philippines, where American forces under General MacArthur were fighting a desperate last stand. To the west, Singapore had just fallen, shocking the British Empire and leaving the Indian Ocean exposed to the south. Australia braced itself for invasion, relying on the Dutch East Indies as a shield. If Japan captured the Indies, Australia's northern approaches would be laid bare, making its defence infinitely more difficult. For the Allies, therefore, the defence of Java and Sumatra became a matter of survival, not just colonial pride. The region tied together the fates of nations, linking Europe's crumbling empires with America's rising role and Australia's desperate defence. In every war room, from London to Washington, maps of the Dutch East Indies became central to strategic planning. It was the hinge upon which the Pacific Campaign turned. In early 1942, its defense or its loss would reshape the entire balance of the war. The Japanese understood this strategic equation with perfect clarity. Their war planners called the Southern Offensive the Strike South, a campaign designed to seize the Indies quickly and decisively. To achieve this, Japan deployed carrier task forces, powerful surface fleets, and veteran invasion divisions hardened by victories in China and Southeast Asia. Their operations were meticulously coordinated, with simultaneous strikes aimed at overwhelming defenders before reinforcements could arrive. The campaign was not simply opportunistic, it was preordained by necessity, designed to guarantee Japan's survival in a war it knew would be long and costly. The capture of airfields in Malaya and the Philippines provided staging grounds for the next phase. Japanese forces moved with calculated precision, sweeping aside resistance on their march toward Java and Sumatra. For them, the conquest of the Indies was not optional, it was the cornerstone of their strategy. Without it, their war would collapse within months. With it, they believed they could forge an empire shielded by resources and defended by the vastness of the Pacific. For the Allies, the importance of the Dutch East Indies demanded sacrifice, even in the face of certain defeat. British, American, Australian, and Dutch forces cobbled together fleets and air units to resist Japan's advance. Their goal was not simply to hold territory, but to delay the inevitable, to buy time for reinforcements and mobilization further south. Every ship deployed into the Java Sea carried with it the knowledge that survival was unlikely, yet the stakes, oil, rubber, tin, and the defense of Australia, left no alternative. In the planning rooms of ABDA Command, officers understood that a confrontation was inevitable, even if the odds were hopelessly stacked against them. The Dutch East Indies was not a colony that could be quietly surrendered. Its loss would embolden Japan, supply its war machine, and threaten the very survival of Allied presence in the Pacific. Thus, the strategic importance of the Indies transformed it into the centerpiece of early 1942. It was here, over these seas and islands, that one of the most desperate naval battles of the Second World War would soon be fought. As Japanese forces surged through Southeast Asia in early 1942, the Allied powers recognized the urgent need for a unified command structure. Separate national efforts had already proved disjointed, with Britain focusing on Malaya, the Americans on the Philippines, and the Dutch on defending their colonial holdings. Each power fought bravely but in isolation, leaving gaps for the Japanese to exploit with their coordinated offensives. To remedy this, Allied leaders created a new coalition force, the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, or ABDA. Its purpose was to pool resources, unify strategies, and present a common front in the defense of the Dutch East Indies. The concept was ambitious, symbolizing international solidarity in the face of disaster. For the first time in the Pacific War, warships, aircraft, and ground forces from 4 nations were grouped under a single umbrella. Yet the idea of unity would soon be tested by immense challenges of communication, culture, and conflicting priorities. ABDA was born of desperation, a fragile shield hastily raised against an enemy advancing with overwhelming momentum. The ABDA Command was formally established in January 1942, less than a month after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Its operational area stretched across a vast expanse encompassing Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and Northern Australia. At its head was British General Sir Archibald Wavell, appointed Supreme Commander due to his seniority and experience in earlier campaigns. Wavell, already burdened with responsibilities in India and the Middle East, faced the near-impossible task of coordinating multinational forces across scattered islands and seas. To assist him, the naval command fell largely to Dutch Admiral Conrad Helfrich, who carried the heavy responsibility of defending his homeland's colonial possessions. Day-to-day naval operations, however, were often directed by Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, commander of the Dutch East Indies Fleet. American and Australian officers contributed ships and aircraft, but often struggled to integrate their forces with Dutch and British counterparts. The arrangement looked impressive on paper, but was plagued by logistical and structural difficulties. The ABDA Command was less a finely tuned machine than a coalition stitched together at the 11th hour. Its survival would depend on improvisation and sheer determination. Admiral Conrad Helfrich, often called the Ship-a-day Helfrich for his aggressive naval philosophy, pressed hard for offensive action. He believed that boldness could compensate for weakness, and urged his subordinates to engage the Japanese wherever possible. His counterpart, Admiral Doorman, commanded a mixed fleet of Dutch cruisers and destroyers, reinforced by British, American, and Australian vessels. Doorman, a seasoned officer with years of service, found himself leading ships that varied widely in age, capability, and maintenance standards. Some cruisers were modern, bristling with powerful guns, while others were relics of World War I, patched together for one last fight. The sailors under his command spoke different languages, followed different procedures, and came from naval traditions that often clashed. Doorman, however, earned respect through his personal bravery and willingness to fight against overwhelming odds. He became the embodiment of ABDA's spirit, resolute, improvised, and tragically doomed. The naval commanders knew they were facing a foe with better aircraft, superior coordination, and stronger fleets. Yet they also knew that retreat was not an option in the defense of the Indies. The multinational nature of ABDA Command was both its greatest strength and its Achilles heel. On one hand, the sight of ships from 4 nations sailing under a single banner carried enormous symbolic weight. It demonstrated to the world that the Allies, despite early defeats, were capable of uniting in common cause. On the other hand, deep divisions lay just beneath the surface. Language barriers caused frequent misunderstandings during critical operations, as Dutch captains communicated in their own tongue while British and Americans relied on English. Equipment was equally diverse, with radios, weapons, and ammunition supplies often incompatible across different fleets. Even tactical doctrines diverged, with British officers favoring traditional formations, while American commanders leaned on aggressive carrier operations. These differences often slowed decision-making at the very moment speed was essential. For ABDA, unity was more aspiration than reality, a fragile facade under constant pressure. Yet in the crucible of war, its commanders had no choice but to fight side by side, however awkward the partnership. The logistical challenges of operating ABDA Command were staggering. The Allied fleet lacked secure bases, forcing ships to refuel and rearm at scattered facilities vulnerable to Japanese attack. Aircraft availability was limited, with only a handful of fighters and bombers to cover immense distances. Spare parts were scarce, and many planes and ships went into battle with little hope of repair if damaged. Communications infrastructure was outdated, with messages often delayed or garbled across long distances. The Japanese, by contrast, operated from captured bases with streamlined logistics and overwhelming air superiority. The Allies faced shortages of fuel, ammunition, and even food, which further sapped morale. Ships often went into combat with reduced speed due to fouled hulls and incomplete maintenance. Every battle became not only a test of courage, but also of sheer endurance against collapsing supply chains. ABDA Command's logistical fragility meant that even the smallest loss was magnified into a strategic setback. The coalition was fighting not only Japan but also its own inability to sustain itself. Beyond material shortages, strategic disagreements plagued ABDA from the start. The Dutch leadership, desperate to defend their colonies, pushed for holding every inch of territory. The British, reeling from the fall of Singapore, sought to conserve forces for the defense of India and the long-term war effort. The Americans, mindful of the Philippines and their growing base in Australia, had yet another set of priorities. Australians, meanwhile, demanded protection of their homeland, fearing invasion from the north. These competing demands created constant friction in planning. General Wavell attempted to reconcile them, but with limited resources, compromise often meant failure on all fronts. Operations were frequently reactive, driven by Japanese advances rather than proactive Allied initiatives. The absence of a clear, unified strategy left ABDA vulnerable to being outmaneuvered at every turn. What held the coalition together was not harmony but desperation, the shared recognition that if the Indies fell, the road to Australia would lie open. ABDA's existence was a gamble that unity, however fragile, might slow Japan's unstoppable momentum. For the sailors and airmen of ABDA Command, daily service carried the weight of inevitability. They fought in ships and aircraft that were often inferior in numbers and technology to those of their opponents. Morale fluctuated between grim determination and quiet resignation as rumors of Japanese victories poured in from Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. Yet there was also pride in their multinational effort, a sense that they were standing together in history's darkest hour. Shared hardships forged bonds between crews of different flags, men who had never imagined serving side by side before 1942. At sea, Dutch destroyers escorted American carriers, while Australian cruisers fought alongside British battleships. In the skies, Allied pilots coordinated dogfights with hastily devised signals and mutual trust. These small acts of unity contrasted with the chaos of command at the higher levels. For the men at the sharp end, ABDA was less about politics and more about survival. In their shared struggle, the idea of coalition became real, written in sacrifice and courage rather than strategy documents. Ultimately, the ABDA command represented both the promise and the peril of coalition warfare in World War II. Its creation was a bold attempt to pool scarce resources and present a united front against Japan's advance. Its failures revealed the immense difficulties of aligning nations with different priorities, traditions, and capabilities under the pressure of imminent defeat. The names Helfrich, Doorman, and Naval became linked with both bravery and frustration, men who fought hard but were given too little to succeed. The ABDA experiment lasted only weeks before the crushing defeat at the Battle of the Java Sea effectively ended its existence. Yet in that brief time, it provided a glimpse of Allied cooperation that would later mature into far more effective coalitions in the Pacific and Europe. The lessons learned about communication, coordination, and the need for shared objectives would shape the rest of the war. ABDA was not victorious, but it was not meaningless. Its short, tragic history illuminated both the desperation of early 1942 and the seeds of eventual Allied success. In the shadow of defeat, the idea of unity endured, even as its first experiment collapsed into ruin. The Japanese advance into the Dutch East Indies was not a sudden lightning strike, but the culmination of a meticulously orchestrated campaign across Southeast Asia. Beginning with the invasion of Malaya in December 1941, Japanese forces displayed an unprecedented combination of speed, coordination, and daring. Their army units, often traveling on bicycles and supported by light tanks, cut through British defences with stunning efficiency. By January 1942, Malaya's defences had collapsed, and Singapore, once regarded as an impregnable fortress, stood exposed. The fall of Singapore in mid-February shocked the world, delivering the largest surrender in British military history. This victory freed Japan's southern armies to push deeper into the archipelagos of Borneo and Sumatra. Borneo, rich in oil, became an early and vital target, with Japanese landings swiftly seizing key fields and refineries. Each conquest brought Japan closer to its ultimate prize, the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. The momentum was relentless, giving the impression of an unstoppable tide sweeping southward. To the Allies, the Japanese advance seemed less like a series of battles than a cascade of disasters. In Borneo, Japanese landings began as early as December 1941, almost simultaneously with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The oil installations at Miri and Seria, controlled by the British and Dutch, were quickly occupied, providing Japan with a much-needed energy supply to fuel its war machine. Resistance from Dutch colonial troops and small British detachments was fierce but short-lived. Ill-equipped and outnumbered, the defenders could not hold against seasoned Japanese assault units. Japanese paratroopers, used innovatively for the first time in the Pacific, seized key airfields with shocking speed. By early January 1942, Japanese control of Borneo was nearly complete, and preparations began for the push into Sumatra and Java. The rapid conquest of Borneo underscored the weakness of Allied defenses stretched across thousands of islands. While the Allies relied on outdated equipment and fragmented command structures, the Japanese exploited surprise, mobility, and overwhelming local superiority. Oil from Borneo immediately began fueling Japanese naval operations. For Tokyo, Borneo was not just a conquest but a logistical victory, laying the foundation for the next phase of expansion. The fall of Singapore marked perhaps the most humiliating Allied defeat of the early war. With over 80,000 troops captured, including large numbers of British, Australian, and Indian soldiers, the city's surrender in February 1942 stunned the Allied world. Japanese commanders celebrated the victory as proof of their superiority over Western powers, long regarded as invincible. The loss of Singapore also severed a crucial link in the defense of the Dutch East Indies. Without Singapore as a forward base, the British could no longer effectively reinforce their allies in the region. The Japanese now had free rein to push toward Sumatra and Java with little fear of interception. Singapore's fall also provided psychological momentum, fueling Japanese confidence and intensifying Allied despair. For local populations, the collapse of colonial defenses shattered the myth of European dominance that had stood for centuries. In Tokyo, the victory was hailed as a turning point that secured the southern flank, but for the Allies, Singapore's loss was the opening of the gates to the Indies. The road to Java was now alarmingly open. With Singapore secured, Japanese forces rapidly launched amphibious and airborne assaults on Sumatra, the western gateway to Java. The Dutch, reinforced by small numbers of British and Australian troops, scrambled to mount a defense. However, Japanese paratroopers, supported by naval bombardments, captured critical airfields such as Palembang in February 1942. Control of Palembang was especially important, as it contained one of the richest oil refineries in Southeast Asia. Allied attempts to sabotage the facilities before capture failed to prevent the Japanese from quickly restoring production. Japanese forces then advanced southward, linking up with naval units and cutting off Allied escape routes. The campaign demonstrated Japan's mastery of combined operations, integrating land, sea, and air power in ways the Allies had not yet achieved. Within weeks, Sumatra was firmly in Japanese hands. The conquest of this vital island not only deprived the Allies of another resource hub, but also paved the way for the decisive battle for Java. The momentum of conquest rolled forward with no sign of slowing. Java, the heart of the Dutch East Indies, now became the ultimate prize in Japan's southern offensive. With its fertile lands, industries, and central position in the archipelago, it was the linchpin of Dutch colonial rule. The Japanese understood that seizing Java would effectively cripple Allied resistance in the entire region. Allied leaders, equally aware of its importance, prepared for a desperate defense. Dutch forces, supported by American, British, and Australian units, consolidated around key ports and cities. Yet the defenders faced a formidable enemy battle hardened by months of unbroken victories. Japanese naval superiority ensured that troop convoys could approach Java with overwhelming protection. Allied intelligence warned that the assault on Java was imminent, but their resources were already stretched to the breaking point. The defenders braced themselves for what would become one of the Pacific War's bloodiest naval encounters. For both sides, Java represented far more than just another island. It was the crown jewel of the Indies campaign. Throughout January and February 1942, Japanese naval and air forces tightened the noose around Java. Carrier-based aircraft struck Allied shipping, while bombers attacked ports and airfields. Allied convoys attempting to bring reinforcements or evacuate civilians came under relentless attack. Submarines prowled the waters, adding to the sense of isolation felt by defenders. The Japanese Navy's superiority in both numbers and quality left the Allies constantly on the defensive. Air raids on Batavia and Surabaya sowed panic, destroying aircraft on the ground and crippling infrastructure. Meanwhile, Japanese landings on outlying islands such as Bali and Timor threatened to cut Java off entirely from outside support. Each blow tightened the encirclement, pushing Allied morale closer to collapse. By late February, the Allies knew that the final assault was inevitable. The stage was set for a climactic confrontation in the Java Sea. The psychological impact of Japan's rapid victories cannot be overstated. In just 3 months, the Rising Sun flag had spread across territories once thought untouchable. Colonial powers that had dominated Southeast Asia for centuries appeared powerless before Japan's relentless advance. Local populations, long subjected to European control, watched the collapse with a mixture of fear and astonishment. To some, Japanese victories seemed to herald a new order in Asia, though this illusion would soon be shattered by the brutality of occupation. For Allied commanders, the speed of Japan's success created a sense of paralysis, as every defensive plan unraveled before it could be executed. Troops and sailors braced themselves for battle, knowing reinforcements were unlikely to arrive. The Japanese, buoyed by confidence, pressed harder with each victory. The psychological gulf between attackers and defenders widened with every passing week. By the time the Allies prepared to fight for Java, the mood on both sides had already been set. The Japanese carried confidence, while the Allies carried only grim determination. Japan's advance into the Indies was more than a series of territorial conquests. It was a strategic revolution in the Pacific War. Within weeks, the empire had gained access to vital oil reserves, rubber plantations, and strategic airfields. These acquisitions promised to sustain its war machine for years, provided they could be held against inevitable Allied counterattacks. The speed of the campaign stunned the world and forced Allied leaders to reconsider their entire Pacific strategy. Japan's bold use of paratroopers, coordinated naval forces, and ruthless efficiency set a new standard for warfare in the region. Yet the very speed of their advance carried hidden risks of overextension. Supply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean, vulnerable to eventual Allied counteroffensives. Still, in early 1942, such dangers seemed distant compared to the triumphs at hand. The conquest of Malaya, Singapore, Borneo, and Sumatra had delivered the empire to the gates of Java. Ahead lay the decisive battle that would determine the fate of the Dutch East Indies. As the Japanese tide swept inexorably toward Java, the Allies scrambled to assemble a fleet capable of resisting the onslaught. This ad hoc force became known as the ABDA fleet, representing the combined strength of the American, British, Dutch, and Australian navies. Its formation was born not of long-term planning, but of desperate necessity, as commanders struggled to defend the Dutch East Indies with what remained after months of defeats. The fleet's composition was a patchwork of aging cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, hastily gathered from scattered bases across the Pacific. While individually brave and determined, The ships lacked cohesion, standardization, and often even compatible communication systems. Admirals and captains faced the monumental task of uniting vessels from 4 different navies under a single command structure. The sense of urgency was palpable, as every man understood the stakes. If Java fell, the gateway to Australia and the wider Pacific lay open. This gathering of ships was less a powerful fleet than a symbol of Allied resolve against overwhelming odds. Yet in the desperate climate of early 1942, even a fragile coalition offered a glimmer of hope. It was this fragile hope that set the stage for the coming naval clash. At the heart of the Allied fleet were several heavy and light cruisers, the backbone of surface combat. The Dutch contributed ships such as HNL-MS De Ruyter and HNL-MS Java, both veterans of colonial patrols, but increasingly outclassed by modern Japanese vessels. Britain added HMS Exeter, a heavy cruiser that had already seen action against the German pocket battleship Graf Spee. Australia sent the light cruiser HMAS Perth, which had fought in Mediterranean waters before being rushed to the Pacific. The Americans contributed the heavy cruiser USS Houston, already scarred from earlier Japanese bombings but still a formidable presence. These cruisers carried the responsibility of bringing heavy firepower to the battle, though most were worn from months of continuous operations. Their aging guns and limited armor made them vulnerable in a modern naval war, dominated by air power and long-range torpedoes. Nevertheless, they represented the core around which the ABDA fleet was built. Each ship carried its own legacy and crew morale, forging a sense of pride amid desperation. They would soon be called upon to face one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most powerful strike forces. Surrounding these cruisers were a collection of destroyers, essential for screening and rapid maneuver in battle. The Dutch fielded ships such as HNL-MS Catena and HNL-MS Whitty de With, lean vessels tasked with protecting larger warships. The British provided destroyers like HMS Encounter, experienced in convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare. The Americans added USS John D. Edwards, USS Alden, and USS John D. Ford, destroyers that had already endured relentless duty since Pearl Harbor. Australia's contribution included HMAS Vampire, a destroyer that had fought bravely in the defense of Malaya. These ships formed the nervous system of the fleet, tasked with scouting, launching torpedo attacks, and protecting vulnerable cruisers from submarine and aerial threats. However, many were short on fuel, spare parts, and modern radar equipment, leaving them at a disadvantage against Japanese coordination. The destroyers' crews, often exhausted from constant action, nonetheless remained defiant and determined. Their courage would be tested in the chaotic close-range battles that loomed ahead. For the men aboard, the destroyers were both shield and sword, fragile yet indispensable in the coming clash. Supporting this surface fleet was a modest but vital submarine force. The Dutch, with years of experience patrolling the East Indies, fielded several capable submarines like O-19 and Capucint, which had already scored successes against Japanese transports. American submarines, though plagued by defective torpedoes, joined the effort, adding numbers if not consistent effectiveness. British submarines also patrolled the waters, hoping to intercept Japanese invasion convoys. Submariners faced extreme danger, operating in shallow tropical seas where enemy destroyers and aircraft made hunting perilous. Yet their mission was clear: to disrupt Japanese landings and delay the inevitable invasion of Java. These undersea warriors carried the burden of stealth and surprise, striking unseen when possible, but often enduring depth-charge hunts. Their contributions were overshadowed by the surface fleet, but they provided a crucial edge in harassment. Each submarine patrol represented both daring and desperation, as crews risked entrapment beneath hostile waters. Though their successes were limited by malfunctioning weapons, their presence forced the Japanese to remain wary. In the greater scheme of the campaign, submarines provided the fleet with a shadowy but essential line of defense. One of the greatest challenges facing the Allied fleet was the issue of multinational cooperation. Each navy brought its own doctrines, languages, and command traditions, creating constant friction in coordination. Orders often had to be translated through multiple channels, slowing response times in combat situations that demanded split-second decisions. Even simple matters, like recognition signals or radio frequencies, required endless negotiation and adjustment. Admiral Doorman, the Dutch commander, bore the responsibility of uniting this disparate force under his leadership. Though respected for his dedication, he struggled with limited resources, conflicting priorities, and the strain of constant Japanese pressure. His role was as much political as military, symbolizing Dutch determination to defend their colony alongside the Allies. Yet beneath the surface, distrust and frustration simmered, with some Allied officers questioning the effectiveness of shared command. Despite these tensions, the sailors and officers forged bonds through shared danger and hardship. In the shadow of overwhelming Japanese strength, they became a reluctant but united brotherhood of survival. Cooperation, though imperfect, was all that stood between Java and disaster. Fuel shortages further hampered the Allied fleet, forcing commanders to ration operations carefully. Many ships had already endured weeks of continuous steaming without proper refueling opportunities. Dutch refineries, once a potential lifeline, were already in Japanese hands or under bombardment. This logistical strain meant that ships often entered battle with dangerously low reserves, limiting maneuverability. Repair facilities were equally scarce, with Surabaya serving as one of the last major Allied bases in the region. Crews worked tirelessly to patch up damaged vessels with limited tools and supplies, often improvising repairs to keep ships afloat. Spare parts for older destroyers and cruisers were almost impossible to obtain, forcing reliance on cannibalizing equipment from less seaworthy ships. Morale remained resilient, but the sailors were keenly aware that they fought with exhausted machines. Each departure from port carried the weight of uncertainty. Would their ships endure another battle? The strain of logistics was as great an enemy as the Japanese fleet itself, sapping strength before a shot was fired. Despite these difficulties, the Allied fleet represented a remarkable act of defiance. Outnumbered and outgunned, they gathered in the Java Sea to make a stand that history would long remember. Sailors from 4 nations shared the decks, bringing diverse accents and traditions into a single fight. Officers drilled their crews in gunnery, torpedo handling, and damage control, knowing survival depended on precision under fire. The fleet's cruisers and destroyers formed into squadrons, preparing for coordinated action against the Japanese. Submarines slipped silently into patrol positions, ready to strike enemy convoys. Every man knew the odds were grim, but none doubted the necessity of their mission. To surrender Java without a fight would have been unthinkable, both militarily and symbolically. The fleet was battered, tired, and ill-prepared, but it carried with it the pride of resisting tyranny. This spirit, though unable to compensate for material weakness, infused the Allied ranks with a determination that steel alone could not provide. They were prepared to fight, and if necessary to die in defense of the Indies. As February 1942 drew to a close, the Allied fleet's presence in the Java Sea stood as the last barrier to Japanese conquest. Behind them lay the island of Java, teeming with soldiers, civilians, and refugees who depended on their courage. Ahead, Japanese invasion convoys steamed southward, guarded by some of the most formidable warships in the Imperial Navy. The Allies knew they would face not only cruisers and destroyers, but also overwhelming air cover from Japanese carriers. Yet retreat was not an option, for the fate of an entire region rested on their stand. Admiral Doorman and his multinational force sailed into history with the knowledge that they were outmatched in every measurable way. What they possessed, however, was a unity born of desperation, forged in the fires of defeat. Their gathering was less about victory than about resistance, less about triumph than about honor. The battle ahead would test their endurance, courage, and sacrifice to the limits. The Allied fleet was assembled, and the hour of reckoning approached. As the Allied fleet gathered in desperation, their adversary, the Imperial Japanese Navy, prepared to unleash a force unlike anything the Dutch East Indies had ever seen. Japan entered 1942 with a navy at the peak of its power, honed by years of rigorous training, modern shipbuilding, and a doctrine that emphasized aggressive, decisive strikes. Unlike the fragmented Allied fleet, the Japanese squadrons were cohesive, disciplined, and commanded by officers deeply experienced in naval warfare. Their ships were not only more numerous, but also technologically superior, boasting long-range guns, powerful torpedoes, and advanced optics for night fighting. Aircraft carriers extended Japan's striking reach, providing aerial reconnaissance and devastating dive bomber and torpedo plane attacks. The Allied sailors knew they faced a juggernaut that had already humiliated Western powers in Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. Each Japanese fleet movement was backed by meticulous planning and aggressive intent, designed to annihilate opponents quickly. Japanese morale soared, bolstered by a string of victories that reinforced a sense of invincibility. In this imbalance of power, the Allies fought not only ships, but also the aura of Japanese dominance. The stage was set for a clash, defined by overwhelming disparity. The core of Japanese naval superiority lay in its heavy cruisers and destroyers, which formed the backbone of its striking forces. Ships such as the Nachi and Haguro, Miko-class cruisers, brought formidable firepower with their 8-inch guns and long endurance for Pacific operations. Their destroyer screens, composed of the Kaguro and Fubuki classes, were unmatched in the world for speed, maneuverability, and armament. Each destroyer carried the fearsome Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, a weapon that far outclassed anything the Allies possessed. Powered by oxygen rather than compressed air, these torpedoes had extraordinary range and destructive capacity, capable of crippling battleships and cruisers in a single strike. The Allies had no equivalent, and worse, many remained unaware of the full potential of this Japanese weapon. Japanese training emphasized coordinated night torpedo attacks, exploiting both stealth and firepower to maximum effect. By comparison, the Allied destroyers often entered battle with outdated tactics and unreliable torpedoes. The contrast was stark, with Japanese crews drilled to perfection in tactics the Allies could not match. This disparity would play a decisive role in the battles to come. Japanese naval aviation provided another crushing advantage, extending the reach of their fleet far beyond gun range. Carrier-based aircraft, such as the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, Aichi D3A Val dive bomber, and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo plane, had already demonstrated their lethality at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines. These aircraft were flown by highly trained pilots with years of combat preparation, many of whom had honed their skills in China. The Zero in particular dominated the skies, combining speed, range, and agility to overwhelm Allied fighters. Dive bombers and torpedo planes delivered devastating strikes with precision, crippling capital ships in minutes. Japan's naval air arm functioned not merely as support, but as the spearhead of offensive doctrine, redefining naval warfare. By contrast, the Allies at Java had no carriers and limited land-based air cover, leaving their fleet perilously exposed. This imbalance meant that every Allied ship faced threats from both surface gunnery and aerial attack, often simultaneously. Japanese aircraft scouted tirelessly, ensuring enemy fleets could rarely move undetected. In the vast expanses of the Pacific, this aerial supremacy was as decisive as guns or torpedoes. Another cornerstone of Japanese dominance was training, which emphasized discipline, precision, and aggressive tactics. Officers and sailors drilled relentlessly in gunnery, torpedo launches, and night operations, creating crews that could execute complex maneuvers instinctively. Night combat was a particular specialty, with Japanese ships employing superior optics and well-coordinated tactics that allowed them to strike under cover of darkness. Allied crews, by contrast, often struggled in night engagements, hindered by lack of radar, poor coordination, and inexperience. Japanese gunnery drills ensured their salvos were accurate and rapid, inflicting devastating damage before opponents could effectively respond. Torpedo tactics were practiced with a near-religious intensity, treating the long lance as the ultimate equalizer against larger fleets. Beyond tactics, Japanese naval culture instilled in its sailors a fierce sense of duty, honor, and sacrifice, rooted in the Bushido tradition. Failure was unthinkable, and success was expected even against superior numbers. This ethos translated into a willingness to take bold risks that often caught adversaries off guard. Allied commanders facing such opponents knew they faced not only ships and weapons, but an adversary with an unwavering will to win. The logistical and industrial base supporting Japanese naval power also gave it temporary advantages in early 1942. Japanese shipyards had produced modern, heavily armed vessels that combined speed and firepower in ways that outpaced Western designs. The Navy had entered the war with a carefully built reserve of fuel and supplies, ensuring its fleets could operate deep into Southeast Asia. The capture of resource-rich territories like Borneo and Malaya further extended this advantage, providing oil to sustain operations. Japanese logistical planning ensured that convoys carrying invasion troops were shielded by powerful escort forces. This integration of strategy and logistics allowed Japan to sustain offensives that seemed unstoppable. By comparison, the Allied fleet struggled with shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, limiting their ability to engage for extended periods. The difference in operational readiness was glaring, with Japanese ships able to fight at full capacity while Allied vessels limped into battle. Every aspect of Japanese naval preparation reflected foresight and confidence. For the Allies, the logistical disparity compounded an already dire tactical imbalance. The outcome seemed foreordained even before the first shells were fired. Yet Japanese superiority was not merely material, it was also psychological. The string of early victories had given Japanese sailors a sense of invincibility that infused their actions with confidence. From the fall of Singapore to the destruction of the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, every triumph reinforced their belief in Japan's destiny as master of Asia. Allied sailors, by contrast, approached battle with memories of defeat and retreat, weighed down by the knowledge of their enemy's power. Japanese propaganda played upon this aura, projecting images of unstoppable might and inevitable conquest. In combat, this psychological edge often made Allied commanders cautious, hesitant to commit fully against a foe they viewed as superior. The Japanese, sensing this hesitation, pressed their advantage with boldness that bordered on recklessness. Even when outnumbered, Japanese commanders often sought engagement, trusting in their crew's skill and weapons. This imbalance in mindset was as potent as the disparity in ships or aircraft. Facing an enemy who believed itself destined to win, the Allies fought under the shadow of near-certain defeat. The weight of morale tilted heavily toward Japan. Technology further widened the gap between the Japanese and Allied fleets. Japanese ships were equipped with advanced optics, giving them superior accuracy in both day and night engagements. Their destroyers carried more torpedo tubes than Allied equivalents, increasing striking power in every encounter. Aircraft were designed for long range, allowing Japanese carriers to strike targets far beyond the reach of their opponents. Even in communications, Japanese discipline and coordination outperformed the fractured Allied system. Allied ships lacked radar, a technology still in its infancy, which meant they often entered engagements blind compared to their enemies. Japanese aircraft, meanwhile, coordinated strikes with devastating efficiency, using precise scouting to fix enemy positions before delivering hammer blows. The Allies' reliance on outdated systems left them perpetually reacting rather than initiating. In every technological measure that mattered in early 1942, Japan held the edge. This advantage allowed them to dictate the terms of battle, forcing their opponents into defensive, desperate positions. The difference between the two sides was nothing less than a gulf of generations in naval preparedness. As the Battle of the Java Sea approached, Japanese naval superiority loomed like an inescapable shadow. Their fleets entered the region with confidence, supported by carriers, cruisers, and destroyers that embodied the pinnacle of naval power at the time. Every aspect of Japanese preparation, ships, aircraft, tactics, and morale, converged into a war machine designed for swift and crushing victories. The Allies, though brave, knew they faced a foe that outclassed them in every respect. Japanese commanders did not fear the Allied fleet. They sought to destroy it swiftly to clear the path for invasion convoys. For them, the Java Sea was not a test of survival, but a stepping stone in a broader campaign of conquest. The imbalance between the two sides was a story of preparation versus desperation, strength versus weakness, dominance versus defiance. This asymmetry would shape every moment of the battle to come, dictating the pace and the likely outcome. The Allies entered the fray with determination, but determination alone could not erase disparity. Against Japanese naval power, they faced not just an enemy, but the embodiment of a ruthless, finely honed war machine. The days before the Great Clash in the Java Sea were marked by tension, anticipation, and scattered skirmishes that hinted at the scale of destruction to come. Both the Allied ABDA fleet and the advancing Japanese invasion force knew that contact was inevitable, yet neither side wished to stumble blindly into annihilation. Reconnaissance flights circled constantly overhead, seeking to pierce the veil of uncertainty across the vast waters. Allied pilots, flying from battered bases in Java, struggled to maintain consistent coverage with outdated aircraft and limited fuel. Japanese scouts, by contrast, operated with precision, sending seaplanes from cruisers and destroyers to shadow the enemy's every move. In this chess match at sea, every maneuver risked exposure, every signal interception could reveal intent. Skirmishes flared at the edges, with destroyers probing and retreating, testing enemy reactions like fencers before a duel. Each brief clash left men shaken, ships scarred, and commanders more cautious. The ocean itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the fleets to converge. The prelude to the battle was as much a test of nerves as it was of steel. The Allied fleet, already aware of its inferiority, relied heavily on reconnaissance to prepare for the coming storm. Dutch flying boats ventured out into contested skies, their crews knowing they faced near certain death if intercepted by Japanese fighters. These flights returned with fragmented reports, shadows of convoys, glimpses of cruisers, and the unnerving presence of aircraft carriers somewhere beyond the horizon. Admiral Doorman pressed his men to remain vigilant, urging constant patrols despite exhaustion and dwindling fuel stocks. Communication among the multinational fleet proved difficult, with reports translated and retransmitted across multiple languages before reaching decision-makers. These delays often blunted the usefulness of intelligence, turning fresh sightings into stale news. Meanwhile, Japanese reconnaissance was both faster and sharper, delivering accurate updates that shaped enemy strategy. As Allied ships patrolled nervously, the Japanese already knew much of their strength and weakness. This imbalance of knowledge tilted the scales further in favor of the invaders. Information, or the lack of it, would prove as decisive as guns and torpedoes. The first real skirmishes erupted as Allied submarines prowled the Java Sea, desperate to disrupt Japanese convoys. Dutch and American subs stalked the heavily guarded transports, occasionally sinking minor vessels, but more often suffering losses from vigilant destroyer escorts. Japanese destroyers dropped depth charges with ruthless efficiency, hunting beneath the waves until steel hulls cracked and crews drowned. The Allies achieved some successes, but the damage inflicted was minimal compared to the enormous invasion force gathering offshore. Each submarine that failed to return represented not only brave men lost, but also one fewer weapon in a fleet already stretched thin. Yet these actions hardened the resolve of the Allies, proving that resistance, however costly, was still possible. Sailors spoke of hearing distant explosions and wondered whether comrades below had struck a blow or met a watery grave. For many, these submarine duels symbolized both courage and futility in equal measure. They were small preludes to the colossal surface battle that loomed ever closer. Each encounter underscored the risks of fighting a superior foe across unforgiving seas. Surface engagements soon followed, as Allied destroyers clashed briefly with Japanese advance elements. These sharp encounters, often fought at night or in poor visibility, tested both skill and nerve. Japanese destroyers, armed with the dreaded long-lance torpedoes, pressed aggressively, forcing Allied ships to maneuver desperately to avoid annihilation. Gunfire echoed across the sea, shells splashing dangerously close to their marks, as crews scrambled to respond. In several engagements, Allied destroyers launched torpedoes of their own, but many malfunctioned or missed, reflecting the technological disadvantage they faced. The exchanges were brutal but fleeting, with Japanese forces often disengaging before committing fully, conserving strength for the decisive encounter. Each skirmish left Allied ships scarred and crews exhausted, but also sharpened their sense of impending catastrophe. For the Japanese, these encounters confirmed the weaknesses of their opponents and bolstered their confidence further. Both sides learned vital lessons in these pre-battle clashes, adjusting tactics in preparation for the main event. The sea itself seemed to tremble with the anticipation of what was to come. The role of air reconnaissance during these early clashes cannot be overstated. Japanese floatplanes launched from cruisers provided constant surveillance, circling high above and relaying positions back to their fleet. Allied ships often fired futilely at these scouts, their shells falling harmlessly short as the aircraft calmly shadowed them. For the men below, the sight of circling aircraft was a constant reminder that the enemy knew their every move. Allied land-based aircraft attempted similar reconnaissance, but their numbers were too few, their endurance too short. On more than one occasion, Japanese fighters pounced on these vulnerable planes, leaving burning wreckage in the sea. Without effective air cover, Allied ships were forced to rely on guesswork and outdated reports, leaving them perpetually at a disadvantage. The imbalance in the skies was clear, and it translated directly into uncertainty at sea. The Japanese prepared to strike with precision, while the Allies struggled to grasp where and when the hammer would fall. This aerial imbalance set the tone for every skirmish leading into the Great Battle. Amid these growing tensions, morale within the Allied fleet began to fray. Crews were exhausted from constant alert, sleeping in short snatches at their guns, always ready for a sudden attack. Rumors of overwhelming Japanese strength circulated freely, eroding confidence even among seasoned sailors. Yet there was also a grim determination, a belief that they must fight regardless of odds to defend the Indies. For the Dutch sailors in particular, the defense of their homeland's colonies carried profound symbolic weight. Australians and Americans fought alongside them, knowing they stood as the last line before Japan's southern advance. Each nationality brought its own pride, its own history, yet the cracks of miscommunication and differing priorities were evident. Orders were sometimes confused, signals misread, and coordination broke down at critical moments. In these small skirmishes, those weaknesses were already exposed for all to see. The men braced themselves, knowing that the next clash would not be a fleeting skirmish, but a full-scale confrontation. Japanese confidence during this prelude was evident in their maneuvers and tactics. Destroyers pushed forward boldly, forcing engagements, then retreating to lure the Allies into disadvantageous positions. Cruisers hung back, waiting for the moment to unleash their heavier guns once the Allied fleet was drawn into range. Every Japanese action was calculated to reveal Allied reactions, probing defenses like a swordsman testing an opponent's guard. The Allies often responded with bravery, charging into combat despite inferior numbers and weapons. Yet bravery could not erase the fact that Japanese tactics were disciplined and precise, guided by superior intelligence. Each time the Allies attempted to mount a coordinated strike, they found themselves outmaneuvered, their blows falling short. For Japanese commanders, these encounters confirmed the readiness of their fleet and the fragility of their enemies. For Allied leaders, they were warnings, ominous signals of the storm approaching. Both sides knew the skirmishes were mere preludes to the cataclysm that loomed. The Japanese were sharpening their blades, while the Allies struggled to hold their ground. As February 1942 drew to its climax, the seas around Java grew thick with the echoes of these scattered fights. Each skirmish, each reconnaissance flight, and each submarine duel was like a drumbeat announcing the inevitable battle. The Japanese invasion force moved steadily closer, convoys escorted by powerful fleets determined to crush any resistance. The Allied fleet, battered but unbroken, maneuvered constantly, waiting for the moment when battle could no longer be delayed. Every man aboard knew that the decisive clash was near, that the scattered encounters had been but shadows of the storm to come. In the silence before dawn, or the tense hours of watch duty, sailors imagined the roar of guns and the flash of torpedoes in their minds. The skirmishes had bloodied them, tested them, and exposed their vulnerabilities. Yet they had also hardened their resolve, reminding them that retreat was no longer an option. The prelude to battle was complete. The opening act had ended. Ahead lay the Battle of the Java Sea, in all its fury, where history would be written in fire and steel. The morning of February 27, 1942, dawned heavy with anticipation, the sea calm yet charged with the promise of violence. Admiral Doorman, aboard the Dutch cruiser Narrated, led his multinational fleet into the Java Sea, determined to block the Japanese invasion force advancing on Java. Reports from reconnaissance confirmed the approach of Japanese transports, escorted by a formidable strike group of cruisers and destroyers. With his ships assembled, the British Exeter and Electra, the American Houston and John D. Edwards, the Dutch Java and Narrated, and others, Doorman prepared for a confrontation against overwhelming odds. The Allied fleet was a patchwork of vessels, varied in age, speed, and firepower, yet united by the desperation to hold Java at all costs. At midday, smoke on the horizon signaled the enemy's presence, dark plumes smudging the blue sky as warships moved into sight. The Japanese escort fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi, arrayed itself with precision, ready to shield the invasion force. Both sides began maneuvering for position, their lines shifting like dueling swordsmen testing range. The moment of decision had arrived, and the Java Sea braced itself for a historic clash. Every sailor knew the next hours would decide the fate of the Dutch East Indies. The opening salvos thundered shortly after 4 p.m. As the Exeter and Houston fired at the Japanese heavy cruisers Nashi and Hagoro, great plumes of water erupted around the Japanese ships, forcing them into evasive maneuvers while returning with their own formidable 8-inch salvos. Shells shrieked across the sea, splashing dangerously close to Allied cruisers, one hitting near Deruta's bow and sending fragments flying. Within minutes, the ocean surface churned with geysers as gunfire intensified, each side seeking to land the first decisive hit. The Allied fleet tried to close the distance to bring destroyer-launched torpedoes into play, but Japanese ships held the advantage with longer-ranged artillery. Smoke clouds billowed as cruisers zigzagged, their wakes slicing white trails across the dark water. The thunder of guns reverberated in the steel hulls, shaking men to their bones as they scrambled between turrets, ammunition hoists, and damage control stations. Amid the chaos, communication faltered, with Allied ships struggling to coordinate under heavy fire. The clash had begun in earnest, and both fleets locked themselves into a brutal exchange. The battle's opening phase was fierce, confused, and immediately costly. The Exeter was the first Allied ship to suffer a crippling blow, struck by an 8-inch shell from the Hagoro. The shell tore into her boiler room, knocking out much of her propulsion and reducing her speed dramatically. Steam hissed and fire roared as engineers fought to contain the damage below decks, their faces blackened with soot and sweat. Smoke poured from the ship, forcing her to turn out of line, disrupting the Allied formation at a critical moment. With Exeter slowed, the Allied cruisers lost cohesion, giving Japanese gunners a clearer field of fire. The sudden withdrawal of one of the fleet's strongest ships created confusion. Doorman's battle line bending awkwardly as he struggled to maintain order. The crew of Exeter, however, worked furiously to keep her afloat, jury-rigging systems while still manning their guns, despite the crippling hit. Their courage embodied the desperation of the day, holding on even as the fleet's chances dwindled. The Japanese pressed their advantage, continuing to hammer the retreating vessel, while targeting others in the Allied line. The early exchanges had already swung the balance toward Japan. Meanwhile, Allied destroyers attempted to launch torpedo attacks to disrupt Japanese formations. The Dutch Courtenaire bravely advanced into the fight, only to be struck by a Japanese long-lance torpedo with devastating accuracy. The explosion ripped the ship in half, sending her quickly beneath the waves in a catastrophic loss of life. Survivors clung to wreckage as flames consumed the sinking vessel, their cries echoing across the battlefield. This sudden destruction shocked the Allied sailors, a grim reminder of the lethality of Japanese torpedoes. Other destroyers pressed forward, releasing their own torpedoes, but most failed to hit, either missing or failing to detonate properly. The contrast between Japanese precision and Allied misfortune became stark, reinforcing the technological disadvantage of the ABDA fleet. Still, these efforts forced the Japanese cruisers to maneuver defensively, briefly relieving pressure on the larger Allied ships. The loss of Courtenaire was a heavy blow, both tactically and psychologically. Yet the Allied destroyers continued to fight on, their crews determined to inflict damage despite the odds. The Houston, one of the most powerful Allied cruisers present, became a prime target for Japanese gunners. Already weakened by previous engagements in earlier weeks, she fought fiercely, unleashing her 8-inch guns with remarkable accuracy. Several Japanese ships reported near misses, with splashes rocking their hulls and shells striking dangerously close. Yet the Houston suffered repeated punishment, her turrets damaged and fires breaking out along her decks. Men struggled to keep ammunition flowing, carrying shells by hand when systems faltered. Despite heavy hits, the cruiser maintained her role at the heart of the Allied line, refusing to break under pressure. Her resilience inspired those around her, a symbol of defiance amid growing chaos. The Japanese recognized her threat and concentrated more fire, determined to silence her guns. The Houston's stubborn endurance became one of the defining features of the early engagement. Her continued presence was both a rallying point and a delaying measure against overwhelming enemy strength. As dusk approached, the battle grew even more chaotic, with gunfire flashes lighting the darkening horizon. Smoke screens were deployed by both sides, ships weaving in and out of cover as gunners strained to track targets through haze and fire. Allied signals became increasingly difficult to follow, hampered by radio breakdowns and the multinational composition of the fleet. Doorman attempted to regroup, waving his signal flags aboard de Ruyter, urging his battered ships back into formation. The Japanese, however, maintained tighter control, their coordination reflecting long hours of training and discipline. Each volley of their guns came with deadly precision, further whittling away at Allied strength. Explosions and the stench of burning fuel filled the air, mingling with the screams of wounded sailors. Yet the Allies pressed on, unwilling to retreat despite mounting losses. The opening engagement had become a battle of attrition, one they could ill afford. Still, they clung desperately to the hope of turning the tide. Throughout the engagement, the looming presence of Japanese transports lingered as the unspoken objective. Doorman's orders were clear: break through the escort screen and strike the invasion force before it could land troops on Java. But the escorts proved too strong, blocking every attempt to push through, their cruisers and destroyers interposing themselves with ruthless efficiency. Each Allied maneuver to outflank was countered. Each attempt to break the line met with withering fire. The frustration aboard Allied ships was palpable, as men realized their blows were falling short of the true target. The invasion force remained untouched, sheltered behind the shield of Japanese warships. Every hour spent in battle drained Allied fuel and ammunition, weakening their ability to resist future strikes. For the Japanese, every minute that passed brought their transports closer to Java's shores. The Allies were locked in a battle they could not afford to lose, but also could not afford to prolong. This grim reality overshadowed every exchange, weighing heavily on commanders and crews alike. As night fell over the Java Sea, the opening engagement drew to a close without decisive victory for the Allies. Their fleet had been battered, losing the Cortana and suffering severe damage to Exeter and Houston. Japanese losses were minimal, their cruisers and destroyers largely intact and still screening the invasion force effectively. The imbalance in firepower and coordination had been laid bare, though the Allies' courage and persistence could not be doubted. Doorman resolved to continue the fight into the night, refusing to abandon his mission despite the odds stacked against him. For the sailors, exhaustion weighed heavily, yet adrenaline and fear kept them sharp through the dark hours. Fires flickered on damaged decks, while wounded men were tended to under dim lights below. The fleets withdrew temporarily to regroup, the echoes of battle still resonating across the waves. The stage was set for the brutal night action that would follow, where desperation would drive men to their limits. The opening engagement had revealed the tragic imbalance between valor and inevitability. The saga of HMS Exeter reached its climax in the Java Sea, where her fate became emblematic of the Allied struggle against superior Japanese firepower. After being crippled in the opening stages of battle on February 27, 1942, she limped westward under constant threat, her damaged boilers limiting her speed. Engineers labored tirelessly below decks, patching ruptured pipes and jury-rigging systems to keep the cruiser moving. Smoke from earlier hits still hung in her compartments, forcing men to work in choking conditions that burned their lungs and stung their eyes. Above, sailors remained at their guns, knowing the Japanese would not relent until she was gone. Exeter's withdrawal weakened the Allied battle line, leaving her exposed and increasingly isolated. Admiral Doorman's fleet pressed on, but Exeter was left vulnerable, trying to survive against a relentless enemy. Japanese reconnaissance planes tracked her movements, relaying her position to cruisers and destroyers closing in for the kill. Every man aboard understood that the reprieve was temporary, and her reprisal was inevitable. The cruiser, once a proud symbol of British resolve, had become a wounded target awaiting the final blow. On March 1st, Exeter's ordeal reached its breaking point when she encountered a Japanese force determined to finish what had begun days earlier. She sailed alongside the destroyers Encounter and Pope, forming a fragile group attempting to escape towards Ceylon. At dawn, the horizon revealed columns of Japanese warships, 4 heavy cruisers and destroyers sweeping in with lethal intent. Within minutes, shells began raining down, exploding around the struggling British cruiser. The crew rushed to battle stations, manning guns that had already seen days of furious use, their barrels worn yet still defiant. Japanese gunnery, aided by superior optics and training, quickly found the range, striking Exeter amidships. The hits tore open her decks, starting fires that roared unchecked as firefighting systems collapsed. Ammunition detonations shook her hull violently, throwing men from their posts and sending fragments whizzing through the air. Despite her crew's bravery, she could not withstand the concentrated assault. Her end, though heroic, was now sealed by overwhelming force. The bridge crew attempted desperate maneuvers, zigzagging to throw off Japanese fire, but Exeter's reduced speed made her an easy target. A devastating shell pierced her boiler room, cutting power completely and reducing the ship to a drifting hulk. Below decks, chaos erupted as steam hissed and compartments flooded, trapping men in darkness and heat. Above, gunners fired blindly, refusing to abandon their weapons even as ammunition dwindled and fires spread unchecked. Captain Oliver Gordon gave the order to prepare for scuttling, knowing the ship could not be saved. Lifeboats were swung out, though many were damaged from the pounding they had endured in earlier battles. The deck was littered with wounded sailors, some carried by their comrades to safety, while shells continued to fall. Japanese cruisers circled like predators, their guns methodically dismantling what remained of the once formidable vessel. Finally, a series of thunderous explosions ripped through her hull, forcing her to list heavily to starboard. HMS Exeter, the last survivor of the Battle of the River Plate, slipped beneath the waves, her service ending in tragedy and fire. The destruction of Exeter was compounded by the fate of her escorts, Encounter and Pope. The British destroyer Encounter, heavily outgunned, fought with desperation, launching torpedoes that failed to find their mark. Japanese cruisers retaliated with merciless accuracy, battering her with shellfire until her structure collapsed under the strain. Fires consumed her decks, ammunition cooked off, and with systems shattered, her captain ordered scuttling to save the crew from further carnage. Men leapt into the sea as the destroyer rolled and sank, a brief flash of defiance extinguished by overwhelming superiority. The American destroyer Pope managed a temporary escape into a rain squall, her crew praying the cover would allow them to slip away. Pursuing aircraft, however, soon found her, hammering the ship with bombs and forcing her to stop dead in the water. Despite gallant maneuvers, her battered frame gave way, breaking apart as explosions tore through her hull. Her survivors clung to debris under strafing fire until eventually captured by Japanese forces. 3 ships had been lost in quick succession, their demise sealing the fate of Allied hopes in the Java Sea. The psychological toll on Allied crews during these final battles was immense, as they realized escape was nearly impossible. Every hit that landed on their ships brought home the reality of Japan's overwhelming firepower and the futility of resistance. Yet, even in this dire situation, acts of courage abounded, with sailors refusing to abandon their posts until the very last order. Gunners stayed at their weapons to the point of exhaustion, even when fire control systems were destroyed and ammunition was carried by hand. Signalmen continued to send out messages as decks burned around them, desperate to warn higher command of their plight. Damage control parties crawled through smoke-filled compartments, patching ruptures and carrying wounded comrades despite the futility. The chaos of exploding shells and raging fires did not break the discipline of these men, who fought until the order to abandon ship could no longer be denied. For many, the plunge into the sea came with a bitter sense of failure, though their endurance had bought precious time. They fought with courage that belied the impossible circumstances stacked against them. Their struggle became a testament to duty carried out under hopeless odds. Japanese accounts of the battle reveal the calculated precision with which the Imperial Navy dismantled the Allied force. Observers recorded the accurate salvos and devastating torpedo strikes as a demonstration of their naval doctrine's effectiveness. Yet even Japanese officers noted the bravery of their opponents, remarking on the stubborn refusal of Exeter and her escorts to yield. The spectacle of ships burning and sinking in sequence underscored both the power and ruthlessness of Japan's advance. For the Japanese, the sinking of Exeter was not only a tactical victory, but also a symbolic triumph over a ship with a celebrated reputation. The River Plate veteran had once humiliated Germany's Admiral Graf Spee, and now she fell under Japanese guns in a different theatre of war. Reports were sent back to Tokyo, lauding the performance of Takagi's fleet and the crushing blow delivered to Allied morale. The victory reinforced Japanese confidence, giving further momentum to their unstoppable expansion across Southeast Asia. For the Allies, however, these losses represented the collapse of a fragile naval defense. The balance of power in the region had been decisively tilted beyond recovery. Survivors of the sinkings endured a new ordeal as they floated in the sea, surrounded by wreckage, oil, and the bodies of their comrades. Some were plucked from the water by Japanese vessels, entering captivity that would bring further hardship and suffering. Others clung to life rafts for days before eventual rescue, dehydrated, wounded and traumatized by the horrors they had witnessed. The cruelty of the tropics compounded their suffering, with sunburn, saltwater sores, and shark attacks preying on the defenseless men. Many were haunted by the images of their ship's final moments, the thunder of explosions, and the cries of fellow sailors echoing across the water. Prisoners captured by the Japanese faced years of brutal captivity, where survival became a new battle in itself. Letters and reports of these men would later reveal the enduring scars of both the naval defeat and imprisonment. The loss of these ships not only decimated Allied naval strength, but also left an indelible human cost. For families back home, news of the disaster came slowly, carrying grief across Britain, America, and the Netherlands. The Battle of the Java Sea had reached a devastating crescendo, its echoes carried in the suffering of survivors. The sinking of Exeter and her companions marked the collapse of Allied naval resistance in the Dutch East Indies. With their cruisers destroyed and destroyer support crippled, there was no longer a fleet capable of challenging Japan's invasion convoys. Admiral Doorman himself had already perished aboard WW2, leaving leadership scattered and morale shattered. The Japanese pressed forward unopposed, landing troops that swiftly overwhelmed remaining defenses on Java. The destruction of the Allied cruisers symbolized more than just tactical defeat. It represented the failure of multinational cooperation under the ABDA command. Exhausted, outgunned, and divided by logistical challenges, the Allies had fought valiantly but without the means to prevail. The loss of these ships underscored the imbalance of resources between Japan and the defenders of the Indies. It also marked the beginning of a dark chapter for Allied prisoners, who now faced captivity under a brutal enemy. In naval history, the demise of Exeter and her escorts became a somber lesson in courage against insurmountable odds. The waters of the Java Sea closed over them, leaving only memory, sacrifice, and tragedy in their wake. Among the many weapons that shaped the outcome of the Battle of the Java Sea, none proved as decisive as the Japanese Type 93 torpedo, known to history as the Long Lance. Developed in secrecy during the interwar years, it represented a quantum leap in naval armament, extending both range and destructive capacity beyond anything the Allies possessed. Powered by oxygen-enriched propulsion rather than compressed air, it left almost no visible wake, making detection nearly impossible in combat conditions. With a range of more than 20 miles and a warhead that could exceed 1,000 pounds, it struck with devastating power unmatched by Allied torpedoes. At a time when Allied forces relied on shorter-range, less reliable weapons, the Japanese had perfected a system that could strike from unseen distances. During the Java Sea battle, this technological edge allowed Japanese cruisers and destroyers to launch waves of torpedoes that sowed chaos in Allied formations. Allied ships, unaware of the full capabilities of the weapon, maneuvered as though fighting conventional torpedoes, leaving themselves fatally exposed. The Long Lance became a silent predator beneath the waves, striking ships suddenly and with catastrophic results. Its effectiveness stemmed not only from engineering brilliance, but also from disciplined training of Japanese torpedo crews. In this clash, technology and doctrine fused to give the Imperial Navy an unparalleled advantage. The Allies entered the battle with little understanding of the true nature of the Long Lance torpedo, a deficiency that shaped their tactical decisions. Western intelligence services had heard rumors of Japanese advances, but they underestimated both the range and power of the weapon. This miscalculation meant Allied commanders often held formations at distances they believed safe, unaware that Japanese salvos could reach them with deadly precision. When salvos streaked silently through the dark waters of the Java Sea, the results were immediate and catastrophic. Ships struck by the torpedoes experienced massive structural damage, with warheads detonating deep below the waterline. Explosions tore open hulls, flooding compartments and killing dozens of sailors in an instant. Secondary explosions followed as fuel and ammunition ignited, leaving ships crippled before their crews could respond. Survivors often described the terrifying violence of the impacts, with decks buckling and water pouring in uncontrollably. For the Allies, the shock lay not only in the scale of destruction, but also in the realization that no safe distance existed. By the time commanders understood what they faced, their formations were already unraveling under the onslaught. The tactical use of Long Lance torpedoes was as important as their technical brilliance, for Japanese commanders wove them seamlessly into battle doctrine. Destroyers and cruisers launched massive spreads, calculating that even if only a few found their mark, the damage would cripple opposing fleets. In the Java Sea, waves of torpedoes forced Allied ships to scatter, breaking cohesion and creating opportunities for gunnery to finish stragglers. This combination of long-range strikes, followed by concentrated gunfire, became a hallmark of Japanese naval tactics. At times, Allied ships never even saw their attackers, as torpedoes streaked invisibly toward them from beyond their assumed engagement zones. The discipline of Japanese torpedo crews ensured rapid reloads and precise coordination with broader fleet maneuvers. This synchronization allowed torpedoes to arrive in patterns that overwhelmed enemy defenses, making evasive maneuvers futile. The torpedoes also carried larger warheads than any Allied equivalent, guaranteeing crippling damage even from a single hit. The synergy of weapon and doctrine transformed the long lance into not just a weapon but an entire philosophy of naval combat. For Allied sailors caught in its path, it felt less like an attack than an unavoidable fate. The sinking of ships such as Doorman and Java highlighted the devastating role played by Japanese torpedoes in deciding the outcome of the battle. Both cruisers fell victim to concentrated torpedo strikes that tore open their hulls with surgical lethality. Survivors recalled the eerie silence before the explosions, the absence of any visible tracks in the water, and the sudden thunder of impacts that shook the ships apart. In moments, vessels that had been maneuvering and fighting were reduced to infernos of fire and twisted metal. These losses were not accidents of fate, but deliberate results of Japanese torpedo tactics designed to break enemy fleets apart. The inability of the Allies to predict or counter these weapons magnified the scale of destruction. Damage control teams struggled desperately, but the size of the warheads ensured that most ships struck by a long lance could not recover. The night sky above the Java Sea, lit with burning oil and exploding ammunition, each inferno marking the triumph of Japanese technological superiority. For many sailors, death came swiftly in the explosions, or slowly in the freezing sea, while survivors remembered the suddenness of it all. The long lance had turned battle into massacre, and its reputation became legend in the aftermath. One of the greatest advantages of the long lance was its invisibility, for its oxygen propulsion left no telltale bubble trail. Allied lookouts, trained to spot the wakes of conventional torpedoes, found themselves blind to the invisible killers racing toward them. This absence of warning removed precious seconds needed to maneuver ships into evasive courses. By the time explosions erupted, it was already too late to react, leaving commanders feeling helpless against an unseen threat. The psychological toll was immense, as crews began to sense death approaching from an unknown direction. Panic and confusion spread as multiple ships were hit in rapid succession, breaking down communication and coordination. In the darkness, commanders could not tell whether they faced surface gunfire, aerial bombardment, or submarine attack. This uncertainty compounded their inability to mount a coherent defense. For the Allies, the battle became a nightmare of guessing and reacting without understanding, while the Japanese pressed their advantage with clinical efficiency. In the Java Sea, the long lance became less a weapon than a ghostly executioner, striking invisibly and leaving devastation in its wake. The long lance's destructive power was further magnified by the weaknesses of Allied ships, many of which lacked sufficient armor or modern damage control systems. Warships designed in the interwar period were never intended to withstand the colossal blasts delivered by these torpedoes. When struck, compartments flooded rapidly, and bulkheads failed under pressure, leading to catastrophic structural collapses. Fires raged uncontrollably as fuel tanks ignited, spreading destruction far beyond the initial impact zones. Even ships that initially survived hits often became unmanageable, listing heavily until they capsized or were scuttled by their own crews. The Japanese understood this vulnerability and targeted cruisers and destroyers with ruthless precision. In the Java Sea, Allied ships often succumbed not just to the first explosion, but to the cascade of failures it triggered. Crews abandoned their vessels in scenes of chaos, leaping into oil-slicked waters under a hail of secondary detonations. The speed with which ships sank stunned survivors, who had little chance to organize lifeboats or save the wounded. Against such overwhelming firepower, bravery could not compensate for structural fragility. The aftermath of the Java Sea battle left Allied commanders struggling to understand the full scale of what had occurred. Reports filtered back of ships lost without warning, crippled by explosions that seemed disproportionate to any known weapon. Slowly, intelligence pieced together the truth of the Long Lance, recognizing that Japan had achieved a technological edge that shifted naval warfare. The revelation forced rethinking of Allied naval tactics, particularly the dangers of closing with Japanese surface forces. In time, countermeasures such as longer-range scouting, air dominance, and improved radar mitigated some of the torpedoes' advantages. But in early 1942, during the desperate defense of the Dutch East Indies, the Allies had no answer. Their losses were compounded by ignorance, a lack of preparation that turned engagements into slaughter. Survivors carried tales of devastation that baffled higher command until the reality became undeniable. The Long Lance was not merely another weapon in Japan's arsenal, it was the decisive factor in its early naval triumphs. In the Java Sea, it wrote its most lethal chapter, forever altering the balance of naval power. In the broader history of naval warfare, the Long Lance torpedo remains one of the most remarkable and feared weapons ever devised. Its role in the Java Sea demonstrated the fusion of engineering innovation and tactical brilliance, creating a weapon that reshaped naval engagements. By crippling Allied cruisers and destroying formations, it allowed Japan to dominate early campaigns and expand unchecked. Yet its success also bred overconfidence, encouraging Japanese commanders to rely too heavily on torpedo tactics, even as Allied strengths grew elsewhere. In later battles, radar-directed gunnery and improved air power diminished the torpedo's advantage, but its legacy endured. For the men who fought and died in the Java Sea, however, it was not an abstraction of strategy, but a force of destruction that decided their fate. The survivors who told their stories remembered the sudden flashes, the deafening explosions, and the helplessness of watching ships torn apart. To them, the Long Lance was the embodiment of Japanese superiority at that moment in the war. Its impact at Java Sea guaranteed Japanese victory, while etching tragedy into the memory of every Allied sailor present. In the narrative of World War II, its name remains synonymous with invisible death delivered across the sea. As the battle stretched deeper into the night of February 27, 1942, the Allied destroyers found themselves on the front line of desperation. With cruisers already crippled or sunk, smaller warships bore the brunt of both defending their larger companions and attempting bold counterattacks. Dutch destroyers like Cortana and American vessels such as John Distant Edwards and Alden pressed forward into the maelstrom. Their captains knew they were outmatched in firepower, yet they sought to hurl torpedoes at Japanese cruisers in one last attempt to disrupt the invasion fleet. Visibility was poor, gunfire illuminated the horizon in bursts of flame, and every maneuver carried the risk of running straight into a Japanese torpedo spread. When Cortana was struck by a Long Lance torpedo amidships, the devastation was instantaneous and horrifying. The ship broke apart within minutes, capsizing with most of its crew still on board. Survivors who escaped described a violent explosion, followed by a desperate scramble in oil-covered waters. For the Allies, The loss symbolized the vulnerability of their destroyers in the face of Japanese weaponry. It was only the beginning of a night filled with attrition and sacrifice. American destroyers attempted to avenge the Dutch loss by charging into Japanese formations, firing spreads of torpedoes in quick succession. Yet their own torpedoes, plagued by faulty detonators and shorter range, failed to find their mark against agile Japanese cruisers. Edwards and her companions pressed dangerously close, their decks vibrating under the strain of full-speed maneuvers. Japanese searchlights cut across the sea, catching the destroyers in sudden beams of blinding light. Gunfire erupted almost immediately, heavy shells slamming into the sea around the Allied ships. Though some rounds missed, splinters and near hits peppered decks, killing and wounding exposed sailors. The destroyers returned fire with their lighter guns, but their shells lacked the punch to penetrate Japanese armor. In this lopsided duel, bravery collided with futility, for the Allied destroyers were effectively throwing pebbles at giants. Their torpedo runs, meant to slow or break the Japanese advance, ended only in further damage to already overburdened ships. Each failed attack left the Allied fleet weaker, the Japanese more emboldened, and the sea littered with burning wreckage. The Dutch destroyer Witte de With attempted to maneuver alongside the damaged cruiser Exeter, hoping to shield it from Japanese fire. This noble effort exposed the smaller ship to overwhelming gunnery and relentless torpedo salvos. Japanese shells rained down, and explosions shook the fragile hull of the destroyer, tearing into its thin armor. Crews worked feverishly to keep weapons operational, even as fire spread across compartments. Despite the punishment, the ship launched torpedoes toward enemy cruisers, desperate to turn the tide. None found their mark, leaving the destroyer exposed without reward. Japanese destroyers, faster and armed with superior weapons, closed in for the kill. They fired spreads of long-lance torpedoes that cut through the dark waters with devastating precision. One struck near the stern, crippling the vessel and leaving it dead in the water. The Dutch sailors, though valiant, were forced to abandon the ship as Japanese firepower proved overwhelming. Elsewhere, American destroyers continued to dart in and out of the engagement zone, attempting to shield larger ships like Houston and Perth. Their efforts were heroic but costly, for every approach drew waves of Japanese counterfire. The destroyer Edwards sustained heavy damage to her superstructure, with casualties mounting as shells tore into her decks. Smoke-filled compartments and wounded sailors struggled to keep weapons manned as the ship staggered through evasive turns. Japanese gunners tracked the destroyer relentlessly, intent on finishing her before she could escape. Although the Edwards survived the night, it was left scarred, battered, and barely seaworthy. Meanwhile, other destroyers, like the Jupiter, struck mines laid by the Allies themselves, a cruel twist of fate in the chaos of battle. The explosion ripped open her hull, killing dozens instantly, and sending the ship sinking into the sea. The confusion of combat made even navigation dangerous, with minefields and wreckage littering the waters. For Allied destroyermen, survival felt as uncertain as victory, and every maneuver carried mortal risk. The Japanese destroyers, by contrast, operated with deadly efficiency, their training and technology combining to dominate the night. They launched coordinated torpedo spreads designed not just to hit, but to corral enemy ships into vulnerable positions. Allied destroyers, already overstretched, found themselves herded like prey into zones of fire. Gun duels erupted at close range, where Japanese accuracy proved superior, and Allied shells often fell short. The imbalance of weaponry turned every confrontation into a gamble the Allies could not win. Torpedo detonations shook the sea at regular intervals, punctuating the night with fiery eruptions that sank or crippled destroyers. Survivors recalled the terrifying sight of long-lance torpedoes detonating under ships, the force lifting vessels out of the water before breaking them apart. The Japanese hunted with precision, pressing their advantage without hesitation. By dawn, the Allies' destroyer screen was reduced to battered remnants, unable to shield their cruisers or mount effective counterattacks. The cost of holding the line fell heavily on these smaller ships, whose sacrifice was both necessary and tragic. The human cost aboard Allied destroyers was staggering, as sailors endured relentless bombardments in claustrophobic conditions. Each new hit sent shrapnel slicing through compartments, turning steel fragments into deadly projectiles. Fire spread uncontrollably in many vessels, forcing men to choose between burning alive or diving into oil-slicked waters. Medical teams worked tirelessly, but the scale of casualties overwhelmed their capacity to save lives. In many cases, wounded men continued to fight, dragging themselves back to their stations despite grievous injuries. Officers gave orders knowing survival was unlikely, yet discipline held firm among most crews. Eyewitnesses recalled scenes of bravery, with sailors refusing to abandon their guns until flames or water consumed their posts. Such stories illustrate the resolve of men who fought not only the enemy, but also the inevitability of their own destruction. Their sacrifices bought time, however fleeting, for larger ships to maneuver or escape. These final acts of defiance underscored the grim reality that courage alone could not reverse the tide of battle. By the end of the engagement, the Allied destroyer force was shattered, reduced to wreckage and battered survivors clinging to the sea. Ships that survived were heavily damaged, their crews exhausted, and their ammunition nearly depleted. Communication had broken down entirely, leaving vessels to act independently rather than as a coordinated force. The Japanese, though also sustaining losses, maintained cohesion and pressed their advantage with unrelenting momentum. Allied commanders recognized that their screen of destroyers, essential to protecting heavier ships, was effectively gone. The vulnerability of cruisers like Houston and Perth increased dramatically without these smaller escorts. Survivors from sunken destroyers floated in the water, watching the Japanese advance inexorably closer to their final objectives. Some were later rescued, while others drifted for days before succumbing to exposure or drowning. The scale of loss became clear only after the battle, when tallies revealed how many destroyers had been sacrificed in vain. For the Allies, the destroyer arm had been bled dry, leaving their fleet exposed and their chances of victory non-existent. The destruction of Allied destroyers during the Battle of the Java Sea symbolized the collapse of resistance against Japan's naval superiority. These small but vital ships had been thrown into the fire, tasked with impossible missions against overwhelming odds. Their torpedoes failed, their guns proved insufficient, and their crews paid the price with their lives. Yet their sacrifice was not meaningless, for their desperate attacks bought critical hours, delaying the Japanese advance and allowing some Allied ships to disengage. The battle also revealed the brutal disparity between Japanese and Allied naval technology, particularly in torpedoes and night fighting doctrine. Lessons drawn from the loss of these destroyers would later inform Allied tactics in the Pacific, where radar and improved coordination gradually turned the tide. But in February 1942, the price was catastrophic, and the seas around Java were littered with burning hulks and drifting sailors. The destroyers had fought with unmatched courage, but against impossible odds, their fate sealed by imbalance in weapons and strategy. In their loss lay both tragedy and inspiration, reminders of the human cost behind naval warfare. The Allies left the battle weakened beyond recovery, their smaller ships consumed in the flames of sacrifice. Dutch Admiral Karel Doorman stood at the heart of the Allied defense in the Java Sea, a figure whose resolve became both a beacon of courage and a symbol of inevitable sacrifice. Born in Utrecht and a seasoned officer of the Royal Netherlands Navy, he carried the weight of defending his homeland's colonies even as the Netherlands itself had already fallen to German occupation. When he assumed command of the ABDA fleet, his orders were painfully clear yet strategically impossible: intercept and destroy Japanese invasion forces heading for Java. Doorman understood that his ships were outclassed in firepower, air cover, and technology, yet he refused to yield without a fight. His determination was fueled by duty to the Dutch East Indies and by loyalty to his multinational force of Americans, British, Australians, and Dutch. In every order he emphasized offensive action, believing that striking boldly was the only way to preserve Allied honor. His flagship, the light cruiser De Ruyter, became the nerve center of these desperate maneuvers. From its bridge, Doorman would signal the commands that defined the course of battle. His leadership embodied both hope and tragedy, for he knew that courage could not erase overwhelming odds. As the battle intensified on February 27, 1942, Doorman repeatedly ordered his battered fleet to continue the attack, despite mounting losses. The Dutch cruiser Cortenna had already been obliterated by a Japanese torpedo, and the British cruiser Exeter was crippled and limping away from the action. Still, Doorman signaled his resolve with the fateful order, "Ik vallen aanvolg me." I am attacking, follow me. This simple but defiant phrase captured the essence of his command, a refusal to retreat in the face of inevitable defeat. Allied captains, though weary and short on ammunition, obeyed his order and pressed forward once more into Japanese gunfire. Doorman's insistence on maintaining cohesion, even as communications faltered and ships scattered, reflected his deep sense of duty. His men recognized the near-suicidal nature of the command, yet many believed retreat would have condemned Java without a fight. The phrase "follow me" became both a rallying cry and a tragic epitaph for the fleet. It symbolized leadership that placed honor above survival, courage above calculation. In that moment, Doorman bound his destiny to his fleet's final charge. On board De Ruyter, the atmosphere was tense but resolute, as sailors carried out their tasks with grim efficiency. The crew knew that their ship, though agile and fast, lacked the heavy armor and gunnery needed to stand against Japanese cruisers. Ammunition stocks were dwindling, and each broadside fired was a reminder of how little remained. Men on deck worked amid smoke and fire, patching damage as best they could while maintaining discipline under constant threat. Doorman moved steadily across the bridge, conferring with his officers, issuing orders with a calm that belied the chaos outside. He was fully aware of the risks he was demanding his men endure, yet he never wavered in his belief that pressing the attack was the only option. The sailors drew strength from his composure, interpreting his presence as both reassurance and inspiration. Even as shells splashed around the cruiser, narrowly missing her decks, the ship continued to surge forward under his direction. De Ruyter seemed to embody Doorman's unbreakable will, a vessel pressing forward into the storm. The sense of shared fate between Admiral and crew bound them inseparably in those final hours. As night fell, the Allied fleet's condition grew increasingly desperate, with losses mounting and formations breaking apart. Doorman's surviving ships, including De Ruyter and Java, maneuvered in fading light, searching for an opportunity to strike the Japanese convoy. Communication failures plagued the fleet, and many ships acted with only partial knowledge of Doorman's intentions. Still, his standing order remained: attack the enemy at all costs. The Allies pressed forward despite exhaustion, damaged engines, and dwindling fuel supplies. Sailors fought not only the enemy, but also the elements, with darkness reducing visibility and increasing the risk of deadly torpedo ambushes. Japanese cruisers and destroyers stalked them with practiced precision, their long-lance torpedoes ready to unleash devastation. Doorman understood the peril of night combat against such a foe, yet retreat was not an option he would entertain. For him, duty demanded pressing forward until either victory or destruction claimed the fleet. That unyielding stance defined his leadership and set the stage for the coming tragedy. The fatal blow came when Japanese cruisers launched a spread of long-lance torpedoes toward the advancing Allied ships. In the chaos of night, Deruta was struck, the explosion ripping into her side with catastrophic force. Fires spread quickly, consuming compartments and trapping men below decks. Panic surged through the ship as sailors rushed to battle stations, struggling to contain the inferno. Doorman remained on the bridge, refusing to abandon his command even as the ship's fate became clear. Reports indicate that he calmly continued issuing orders, ensuring the evacuation of survivors rather than seeking to save himself. His dedication to his men in those final moments cemented his reputation as a commander who shared their fate without hesitation. As Deruta slipped beneath the waves, Doorman went down with his ship, fulfilling the sailor's code of ultimate sacrifice. His death marked not only the loss of a leader, but also the symbolic collapse of Allied resistance in the Java Sea. The Admiral, who ordered "Follow me," had chosen to lead to the very end. Nearby, the Dutch cruiser Java also fell victim to Japanese torpedoes, erupting in flames before sinking rapidly. The near-simultaneous destruction of both Dutch cruisers shattered what remained of Allied cohesion. Survivors abandoned ship into oil-slicked waters, clinging to debris as Japanese warships continued to press forward. The loss of Doorman meant that the fleet no longer had central leadership, leaving each surviving vessel to fend for itself. Some destroyers and cruisers attempted to disengage under cover of darkness, but few would survive the days that followed. For the Allies, the sinking of Deruta and Java represented not only tactical defeat, but also the extinguishing of hope for defending Java. Sailors in lifeboats remembered seeing the glow of flames across the horizon, knowing their admiral had perished in the inferno. His decision to remain aboard rather than escape was retold with reverence by survivors, a testament to his sense of duty. The battle's outcome was sealed, and the Allies faced the grim reality of defeat. Admiral Doorman's loss marked the beginning of the end for the defense of the Dutch East Indies. The legacy of Admiral Doorman's leadership was shaped as much by his defiance as by the futility of his mission. His insistence on continued attack, even in the face of annihilation, has been debated by historians as both heroic and tragic. Some argue that his rigid adherence to orders squandered precious ships and lives in a hopeless battle. Others contend that retreat was impossible, as surrender without resistance would have dishonored the Allied cause and demoralized populations under threat. For the Dutch, his sacrifice became a powerful symbol of resistance, even as the East Indies fell under Japanese control. Among Allied sailors, his command inspired respect for his bravery, though many recognized the inevitability of defeat. The order "Follow me" lived on as a reminder of leadership under impossible circumstances. His story illustrates the tension between duty and pragmatism in wartime command. Admirals often face choices where survival and honor are in direct conflict, and Doorman chose honor. That choice cost him his life, but gave his men a legacy of defiance remembered long after the battle ended. In the broader narrative of World War II, Admiral Doorman's death at sea epitomized the courage and tragedy of the early Allied struggles in the Pacific. His determination to confront overwhelming Japanese power, even with inadequate resources, reflects the desperation of early 1942. The fall of Deruta and the loss of Doorman sealed the fate of the Java Sea battle, opening the way for Japan's conquest of the Dutch East Indies. Yet his refusal to retreat became a rallying point, demonstrating that even in inevitable defeat, resistance mattered. The sacrifice of Doorman and his men foreshadowed the resilience that would later define Allied campaigns, where better resources and strategies turned the tide. For the Netherlands, his story became part of national memory, embodying the struggle of a small nation caught in a global war. For historians, his leadership remains a case study in both the nobility and limits of human resolve. The Java Sea was lost, but Doorman's final order echoed across history. Follow me became not just a command, but a legacy of sacrifice and unyielding duty. In death, Admiral Doorman secured his place as one of the tragic heroes of the Pacific War. As dusk fell on February 27, 1942, the Java Sea transformed from a battleground of smoke and flame into a theater of shadows and confusion. The fading light erased the thin advantages of visibility that the Allied fleet occasionally enjoyed during the day. Communication lines between ships had already been fragile, relying on visual signals, blinking lamps, and sometimes faulty radio transmissions. Darkness compounded the difficulty, making coordination between cruisers and destroyers nearly impossible. Japanese ships, disciplined and accustomed to night tactics, exploited the cloak of darkness with lethal precision. Allied vessels, many from different navies with varying procedures, struggled to maintain formation. The chaos grew as signals were misread, orders misunderstood, and movements uncoordinated. Individual captains were often left to act on instinct rather than clear directives. The once unified Allied fleet now resembled scattered fragments groping in the dark. This disarray left them vulnerable to the Japanese mastery of night fighting. Japanese destroyers and cruisers stalked the Allied formations like predators circling wounded prey. They moved silently in the darkness, using training honed in years of night maneuvers to close distances undetected. The Japanese long-lance torpedoes, with ranges and explosive power far beyond anything the Allies possessed, became the decisive weapon in the shadows. Allied ships without radar were forced to rely on spotlights and the faint silhouettes of ships against the horizon, exposing themselves to ambush. The enemy's superior optics and night discipline gave them a devastating edge. Suddenly, columns of torpedoes would slice through the water, their invisible wakes carrying destruction toward unsuspecting cruisers and destroyers. Shell fire erupted sporadically, but gunnery accuracy plummeted in the darkness. Explosions illuminated the night sky in flashes, momentarily revealing the chaos before fading into blackness again. For Allied crews, it felt like being hunted in a vast, silent ocean. Panic mingled with courage as sailors braced for strikes they could not see coming. Miscommunication among the Allies compounded the terror, with ships often maneuvering independently or misinterpreting signals. British, American, Dutch, and Australian captains all operated under slightly different doctrines, creating confusion in the heat of battle. When orders were flashed from Doorman's flagship, they were sometimes misunderstood due to language barriers or the stress of combat. Destroyers darted in directions not intended, breaking cohesion and exposing flanks. Allied cruisers, meant to fight as a cohesive line, often became separated, firing at vague shapes they could not clearly identify. Friendly ships occasionally risked hitting one another, mistaking silhouettes in the darkness for enemy cruisers. The Japanese exploited every error, weaving through the gaps in Allied formations. Torpedo salvos were launched with mathematical precision into these broken patterns. Each misstep widened the chasm between Allied ships and effective resistance. In this chaos, unity of purpose dissolved into a desperate struggle for survival. One of the night's most devastating moments came when Allied destroyers attempted aggressive torpedo runs against the Japanese. Their bravery was unquestioned, but their equipment was no match for the enemy's long-lance arsenal. American and Dutch destroyers launched torpedoes that fell short or failed to strike their intended targets. Japanese cruisers countered swiftly, releasing spreads of torpedoes that carved into Allied formations. Explosions tore through steel hulls, sending geysers of water and flame skyward. Ships reeled under the impact, with compartments flooding and decks engulfed in fire. Sailors scrambled to seal bulkheads, man pumps, and fight blazes, even as new torpedoes sped silently toward them. The eerie silence before each detonation left crews paralyzed with dread, waiting for impact. Courage clashed with despair as destroyer captains sacrificed their vessels to shield larger cruisers. Yet in the darkness, their sacrifices often ended in fiery deaths with little gained. The disintegration of command was painfully evident as the night dragged on. Admiral Doorman's signals to continue the attack reached only some ships, while others broke away, believing retreat had been ordered. The lack of centralized communication left Allied ships fighting piecemeal battles against a coordinated enemy. Smaller destroyers were cut off, engaging superior Japanese ships alone until they were overwhelmed. Larger cruisers pressed forward blindly, guided only by memory of earlier orders and instinctive determination to fulfill them. Misaligned courses led to near collisions, and some ships were forced to scatter entirely to avoid crashing into each other. The Japanese, by contrast, maintained disciplined formations and executed their attacks with deadly synchronization. In this imbalance, the Allies were bled ship by ship. Every passing hour drained their strength, while the Japanese remained in control of the battlefield. The battle had devolved into a nightmare of confusion and destruction. The psychological strain on sailors was immense, as they fought in conditions that offered no reprieve from fear. Men at the guns could not see their targets clearly, often firing at phantom shapes. Engine crews toiled in stifling compartments, unaware if the next torpedo would tear through their section of the ship. Above deck, lookouts strained their eyes against the night sky, desperate to spot incoming threats before it was too late. Each flare of a searchlight or muzzle flash became both a brief relief and a terrifying exposure. Survivors recalled the sensation of fighting blind, a helplessness magnified by the knowledge of Japanese superiority in night combat. Every explosion carried the possibility of death, and every order carried uncertainty. Courage was tested not only by enemy fire, but by the oppressive weight of confusion. The battle was no longer a contest of strategy, but a test of endurance against chaos. For many sailors, it was the longest night of their lives. As the night wore on, more Allied ships were claimed by Japanese torpedoes. The Dutch cruiser Java was struck and torn apart, its wreckage burning as it slid beneath the waves. The loss of such vessels further shattered Allied morale, even as surviving ships pressed forward under Doorman's standing orders. Destroyers attempted last-ditch counterattacks, rushing Japanese ships with guns blazing, but were often annihilated before reaching striking distance. Lifeboats filled the water as survivors clung to wreckage, watching helplessly as their comrades perished in flames. The Japanese showed no mercy, maintaining relentless pressure with each attack. For the Allies, the sea itself became a graveyard, scattered with oil slicks, debris, and human cries. The destruction was so overwhelming that sailors later described it as fighting against an enemy both invisible and inevitable. By dawn, the Allied fleet had been reduced to fragments, their hopes drowned with their ships. The night had stripped them of cohesion, leadership, and strength. The chaos of the night fighting sealed the fate of the Battle of the Java Sea, marking it as one of the most disastrous naval defeats for the Allies in World War II. Miscommunication, lack of coordination, and inferior technology converged with Japanese mastery of night combat to devastating effect. Admiral Doorman's courage was unquestioned, but his fleet was too fractured to fight effectively in the dark. The Japanese, armed with superior torpedoes and disciplined night tactics, demonstrated how preparation and training could decide battles even before daylight returned. Survivors of the night carried with them memories of confusion, horror, and helplessness that would haunt them for life. The carnage underscored the critical importance of radar, unified command, and advanced torpedo technology, advantages the Allies would develop in later years. But in February 1942, those lessons came at the cost of ships, lives, and the collapse of Allied naval power in the Dutch East Indies. The night had shown how chaos could be as deadly as enemy fire, and in that chaos, the Allies' hopes of stopping Japan at sea were extinguished. The Java Sea now belonged to the rising Empire of Japan. As the sun rose on February 28, 1942, the waters of the Java Sea revealed the true scale of devastation. Oil slicks spread across the horizon, their rainbow sheen punctuated by floating wreckage and lifeless bodies. Smoke lingered over the sea, marking where Allied cruisers and destroyers had gone down during the desperate night fighting. Survivors clung to rafts or debris, awaiting rescue in seas still prowled by Japanese warships. For the Allies, the once proud fleet assembled to defend Java had been reduced to fragments scattered across the ocean. The Dutch light cruisers Java and De Ruyter lay at the bottom, their crews entombed with them. The British cruiser Exeter, already crippled, limped westward with only a faint chance of survival. Destroyers from the US and Dutch navies, heavily damaged, attempted to regroup or withdraw. Yet even in retreat, the Allies were hunted by relentless Japanese forces. The battle's outcome was not merely a defeat, but the near destruction of ABDA's naval strength. Admiral Doorman, whose determination had symbolized Allied resistance, was gone, lost with his flagship De Ruyter. His final order to attack the enemy had echoed through the fleet, driving his ships onward even as disaster unfolded. With his death, the already fragile Allied command structure collapsed entirely. Captain-level officers were forced to assume leadership of scattered ships, many of which had little contact with each other. Communications were shattered, leaving vessels to make independent decisions about survival. Some attempted to retreat toward Australia, while others aimed for the safety of Ceylon or scattered bases across the Indies. Yet the Japanese dominated the seas, controlling the routes that Allied ships would have to traverse. The loss of Doorman also carried immense symbolic weight, for he had become a figure of national defiance in the Netherlands. His disappearance beneath the waves marked not only the death of a man, but the end of a unified stand in the Java Sea. The Allies had no choice but to accept that the battle had been a catastrophe. The Allied fleet's losses were staggering and unprecedented for such a short engagement. 2 Dutch cruisers, 2 British destroyers, and 1 American destroyer had been sunk outright during the main battle. Several other ships were crippled, unable to continue fighting, and forced to limp toward distant ports. Thousands of sailors had perished in the flames, explosions, and cold waters of the Java Sea. Survivors recalled scenes of chaos as men leapt into burning seas or clung desperately to overturned lifeboats. Japanese warships, largely unscathed, remained in control of the battlefield, picking off stragglers or pressing their advance toward invasion objectives. Allied submarines, too few and too distant, could do little to avenge the losses. The imbalance of casualties highlighted the overwhelming superiority of Japanese naval power in early 1942. What had begun as an attempt to halt an invasion had ended as one of the greatest defeats in Allied naval history. The Java Sea became a graveyard not just of ships, but of Allied hopes to defend the Indies. The survivors who managed to escape the battlefield carried with them haunting memories. Men aboard the crippled British cruiser Exeter recalled the acrid stench of burning oil and the cries of wounded sailors trapped below decks. American destroyermen described frantic firefights fought until their ammunition ran dry before their ships slipped beneath the waves. Dutch sailors, watching their homeland's last fleet crumble, felt both grief and resignation. Some were picked up by friendly vessels, while others drifted for hours before reaching land or being rescued. The psychological toll was immense, for the battle had shown them how helpless they were against a far stronger foe. Sailors who survived would later testify to the courage of their comrades, but also to the despair that swept through the fleet in those final hours. Loss was not abstract, but personal. Shipmates, friends, and leaders gone in minutes. For many, survival felt more like a burden than a victory. They were witnesses to the collapse of Allied naval resistance in Southeast Asia. In the aftermath, Allied leaders were forced to confront the crushing reality of defeat. The ABDA command, conceived as a multinational bulwark against Japanese expansion, had been effectively destroyed. Its fleets lay at the bottom of the Java Sea, its coordination exposed as inadequate against a disciplined and unified opponent. The Japanese had not only won a tactical victory, but had shattered the illusion that the Indies could be defended by sea. Strategically, the road to Java now lay wide open, with little naval opposition remaining to resist the invasion convoys. For Britain, it meant further isolation of Singapore's survivors and the loss of yet another vital colony. For the Netherlands, it meant the effective end of Dutch power in the East Indies. For the United States and Australia, it meant the war had grown closer to their shores than ever before. The consequences of Java were immediate and dire. The Allies now had to retreat, regroup, and reconsider their entire Pacific strategy. The Japanese, meanwhile, viewed the battle as a decisive confirmation of their naval supremacy. Their losses had been minimal compared to the destruction inflicted upon their allies. Captains and crews celebrated their victories, yet they also acknowledged the relentless nature of their mission. The invasion of Java was not merely about conquest, but about securing vital oil and resources to sustain Japan's war machine. With ABDA destroyed, those objectives appeared within reach. Japanese commanders praised the effectiveness of their long-lance torpedoes, which had devastated Allied formations during the night battle. They also highlighted the superiority of their training, discipline, and coordination, particularly in night engagements. For Tokyo, the battle reaffirmed the strength of the Empire's naval doctrine. Yet within this triumph lay the seeds of overconfidence, as Japan underestimated how quickly the Allies would learn from their defeat. For now, however, the Java Sea stood as proof of Japan's dominance in 1942. The aftermath was also marked by scenes of tragedy for local populations in the Dutch East Indies. Coastal villagers witnessed the seas littered with wreckage, bodies, and oil, reminders of a battle fought near their homes but far beyond their control. Survivors who washed ashore were sometimes aided by locals, despite the risks of Japanese reprisals. Others were captured by enemy patrols and marched into captivity. For the people of Java and surrounding islands, the defeat of the Allies meant the tightening grip of Japanese occupation. Hope that the naval battle might protect them evaporated overnight. Instead, they braced for the harsh realities of occupation, forced labor, exploitation, and repression under a new empire. The seas that had once symbolized a barrier of protection had instead become highways for conquest. The destruction of the Allied fleet not only marked a military defeat, but also a human one, sealing the fate of millions in Southeast Asia. For locals, the smoke on the horizon signaled a dark future. The crushing reality of the Java Sea's aftermath was that the Allies had fought bravely, but were entirely outmatched. Courage and determination could not overcome inferior ships, outdated technology, and fractured command structures. Japan's victory highlighted the brutal truth that war favored preparation, training, and superiority in weapons. For the Allies, the battle was a harsh lesson in what it meant to fight a modern naval war against a prepared enemy. The survivors who escaped carried with them not triumph, but the knowledge of a disaster that would shape future strategy. The Battle of the Java Sea was more than a single engagement. It was the effective end of Allied naval defense in the Indies. Its aftermath set the stage for Japan's invasion of Java, cementing their dominance in Southeast Asia. But even in defeat, the sacrifices of Allied sailors served as a warning that the fight would continue. From the ashes of this disaster, a stronger and more unified Allied effort would eventually emerge. Yet in February 1942, only loss and grief remained in the aftermath of the battle. The defeat in the Java Sea on February 27, 1942, had left the Allied naval presence shattered, but it was not yet entirely destroyed. A few damaged cruisers and destroyers remained afloat, attempting to escape the encircling net of Japanese naval and air power. Among them were the heavy cruiser USS Houston and the Australian light cruiser HMAS Perth, both ordered to withdraw toward the Sunda Strait. Their mission was desperate: break through Japanese invasion fleets assembling for the landing on Java and attempt to reach safer waters. Unknown to them, however, Japanese forces had already moved into position with overwhelming strength. Thousands of troops and dozens of transports were covered by a screen of powerful warships, including heavy cruisers and destroyers. The stage was set for yet another clash, one that would prove just as disastrous as the battle only days before. Unlike the earlier fight, there was no illusion of parity. This would be survival against impossible odds. As night fell on February 28, 1942, the waters of Sunda Strait became the scene of carnage. The Allies' fate was about to be sealed. On the evening of February 28th, Houston and Perth approached the narrow waters of the Sunda Strait, unaware that Japanese invasion convoys were already inside. Their commanders, Captain Albert Rooks on Houston and Captain Hector Waller on Perth, believed they might find a gap through which to escape. Instead, they encountered a vast Japanese fleet, landing troops on Java, escorted by cruisers and destroyers. Outnumbered and outgunned, the two Allied cruisers nevertheless charged into battle, firing salvos into the crowded Japanese formation. The night sky erupted in flashes of gunfire, tracers streaking across the horizon, and explosions rippling across transports. Initially, the two ships inflicted chaos, striking Japanese vessels and sinking several transports. Yet the sheer volume of enemy fire soon overwhelmed them, with Japanese destroyers launching wave after wave of deadly long-lance torpedoes. As the minutes stretched into hours, the two Allied ships were caught in a web of firepower from all directions. The battle had become a hopeless last stand. HMAS Perth was the first to succumb. After nearly an hour of ferocious combat, she was struck by multiple torpedoes and shells, her decks ablaze, her engines crippled. Captain Waller gave the order to abandon ship, but few had time to escape as the cruiser rolled and slipped beneath the waves. Out of her crew of nearly 700 men, more than half were killed in the sinking, while many survivors were captured and endured years of brutal captivity. The Perth's sacrifice was not in vain, as she managed to inflict heavy damage on Japanese vessels during her final fight. Yet the loss was another blow to Allied morale, as one of Australia's most celebrated warships vanished in a blaze of fire. Her sinking marked the collapse of one half of the Allied rearguard. In the darkness of Sunda Strait, only the battered Houston remained, still firing defiantly at an enemy force many times its size. Her crew knew their fate, yet they fought on with grim determination. The courage of Perth had set the stage for Houston's heroic last stand. USS Houston, already damaged from earlier battles and short of anti-aircraft ammunition, pressed the fight alone after Perth was gone. Captain Rooks maneuvered his cruiser through a storm of torpedoes and shells, striking back at Japanese destroyers and transports with her remaining guns. For more than an hour, Houston battled against impossible odds, her silhouette lit by flames as she scored hits even while taking damage herself. Eventually, she was struck by multiple torpedoes tearing massive holes in her hull. Fires spread uncontrollably, and the ship began to list heavily as compartments flooded. Despite this, her guns continued to fire until the very end, her crew refusing to surrender. Captain Rooks was killed in action, and his ship soon followed, sinking with more than 600 men aboard. Survivors were fished from the sea by Japanese vessels and taken into captivity, where many would perish as prisoners of war. The destruction of Houston removed the last major American surface combatant in the region. The Sunda Strait had claimed both ships, sealing the fate of Allied hopes in Java. While the loss of Perth and Houston was catastrophic, it was not the only disaster to strike Allied forces in the wake of the Java Sea. On March 1, 1942, the remaining ships of the Allied fleet, including HMS Exeter, HMS Encounter, and the American destroyer USS Pope, attempted to flee toward Ceylon. Exhausted, damaged, and short of ammunition, they were intercepted by a Japanese force of heavy cruisers and destroyers. The Exeter, already limping from her earlier wounds, was quickly overwhelmed and sunk after a gallant fight. Encounter was struck down soon after, unable to withstand the barrage of shells and torpedoes. USS Pope fought desperately, even managing to damage enemy cruisers, but was eventually hunted down by aircraft and finished in the waters south of Borneo. The destruction of these ships completed the annihilation of ABDA's surface fleet. In just a few days, the Allies had lost nearly every major warship in the Dutch East Indies. The remnants of the once proud fleet were gone. The destruction of Allied naval forces in the Sunda Strait and the second clash in the Java Sea left the region completely exposed. Without cruisers or destroyers to challenge them, Japanese invasion convoys moved unopposed into Java. The Dutch colonial government, already weakened and fragmented, now faced the full weight of Japanese military occupation. Soldiers, sailors, and civilians across the Indies realized that resistance had collapsed, and survival was now the only option. For the Allies, the losses represented not just ships, but the end of their strategic presence in Southeast Asia. Britain, already reeling from the fall of Singapore, saw its empire further dismantled. The United States, still recovering from Pearl Harbor, was forced to pull back and consolidate its forces further east. Australia, left exposed, braced for the possibility of invasion. The psychological impact of these defeats was as profound as the material loss. The Sunda Strait and Java Sea marked the end of one chapter in the Pacific War. The Allies had been driven out of the Indies. The human toll of these follow-up battles was immense. Thousands of sailors perished in the flames, explosions, and waters of the Sunda Strait and Java Sea. Survivors faced long years of captivity in Japanese prison camps, where disease, starvation, and forced labor claimed countless more lives. Many endured the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, where Allied POWs suffered brutal conditions and high mortality rates. Families back home received little news, only vague reports of ships missing in action or presumed lost. For Australia, the loss of HMAS Perth became a national tragedy, symbolizing the sacrifices made in defense of distant waters. For the United States, the sinking of Houston was a painful reminder of the Pacific's vast cost in blood and steel. For Britain and the Netherlands, the end of their ships marked the collapse of colonial power in Asia. The tragedy of these men became part of a larger narrative of suffering and resilience. In the end, their sacrifices were remembered as acts of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. The cost of these battles would echo for decades. The battles of the Sunda Strait and the second clash in the Java Sea were not merely tactical defeats, but turning points of strategic consequence. They confirmed the complete destruction of ABDA naval power and left the Japanese free to seize the Dutch East Indies unchallenged. They demonstrated the extraordinary effectiveness of Japanese naval doctrine, particularly the deadly long-lance torpedo and night fighting tactics. They also revealed the weaknesses of Allied coordination, communication, and outdated equipment. Yet, in their sacrifice, the Allied crews bought time for the regrouping of forces in Australia, Ceylon, and beyond. These final desperate battles also foreshadowed the tenacity with which the Allies would later fight, refusing to surrender despite overwhelming odds. The courage of the men aboard Houston, Perth, Exeter, and the rest became legend, remembered as examples of duty and honor against hopeless odds. Strategically, Japan emerged victorious, but it was a victory that would not last forever. The seeds of future Allied determination were planted in these defeats. The Sunda Strait and Java Sea, though tragic, were part of the long road to eventual Allied resurgence. The Battle of the Java Sea and its follow-up clashes were not just measured in ships lost or territories surrendered, but in the immense human cost borne by those who fought. Thousands of sailors, many still in their teens or early 20s, found themselves cast into burning seas as their vessels erupted under Japanese fire. Survivors clung to rafts, debris, and oil-slicked wreckage as night fell, the cries of the wounded echoing across the dark waters. Sharks circled beneath them, adding another layer of terror to an already hopeless situation. Some men suffered from grievous burns, their bodies coated with fuel oil, while others endured broken limbs or internal injuries from explosions. The smell of smoke and cordite lingered in the air, mingling with the sickly sweet stench of death. For many, the most haunting memory was not the noise of battle, but the silence that followed, broken only by the moans of the dying. Rescue came slowly, often from the enemy themselves, and only for those lucky enough to be noticed. For countless others, the Java Sea became their grave. The scale of this human suffering was beyond calculation. Survivor accounts reveal the harrowing ordeal of those who managed to escape the sinking ships. On the USS Houston, men recalled the ship's final guns firing even as she rolled over, and many jumped into the sea with little more than lifebelts or makeshift rafts. Some described seeing their captain's body carried away in the chaos, a sobering reminder of the ultimate price of leadership. Survivors of HMAS Perth recounted how their cruiser shuddered from multiple torpedo hits, the decks tilting sharply as fires roared out of control. Men leapt overboard into a sea of flame with burning oil, the water searing their skin as they fought to stay afloat. Others clung to floating wreckage, calling out for shipmates who never answered back. Hours passed as Japanese destroyers scoured the waters, rescuing some but leaving many to perish. The fear of being machine-gunned from above was constant, though most survivors were instead captured. The ordeal was not over with the sinking, it had only just begun. The nightmare for those spared the sea was captivity. For many sailors, captivity under the Japanese proved to be another death sentence in slow motion. Survivors of Houston and Perth were forced into prison camps across Java and the wider Pacific, enduring starvation, disease, and relentless brutality. Dysentery and malaria swept through the camps, killing men more effectively than bullets or shells. Daily beatings, forced labor, and inadequate rations reduced once healthy young sailors to emaciated skeletons. Many were eventually transported to work on the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, where conditions were so appalling that survival was a matter of chance. Families back home received little information, often clinging to hope long after their loved ones had perished. Letters, if they arrived, were censored and brief, masking the truth of daily suffering. Some survivors later described captivity as worse than the battle itself, a drawn-out ordeal that tested the limits of endurance. Liberation came years later, but many men never returned. The human cost extended far beyond the sinking of ships. Those who survived at sea without capture told equally harrowing stories. Some drifted for days in lifeboats or on rafts, exposed to sun, salt water, and thirst that became unbearable. Men drank seawater despite knowing it would kill them, their desperation overwhelming reason. Others succumbed to madness, hallucinations, and despair as days stretched on with no sign of rescue. Sailors described watching friends die beside them, their bodies pushed gently into the sea when hope was gone. Some clung to survival, only through sheer willpower, repeating prayers or memories of home to keep themselves alive. Rescue often came from unexpected directions, neutral ships, passing Allied vessels, or even fishermen who risked punishment to aid them. Yet even when rescued, many survivors bore lifelong scars, both physical and psychological. Sunburn, salt sores, and malnutrition marked their bodies, while nightmares haunted their sleep for decades. The battle never truly ended for those who drifted on the open sea. It followed them home for the rest of their lives. The casualties of the battle were staggering. More than 2,000 Allied sailors were killed in the Java Sea campaign, including hundreds aboard Houston, Perth, Exeter, and Deruta. Thousands more became prisoners of war, subject to years of mistreatment and forced labor under Japanese captivity. The loss of life represented not only individuals but entire communities back home that mourned together. In the Netherlands, towns grieved for sailors of the Dutch cruisers, while in Australia, the sinking of Perth left a scar on the national psyche. In the United States, the Houston became a symbol of sacrifice, known as the galloping ghost of the Java coast. Britain, already reeling from the fall of Singapore, saw yet another fleet decimated, deepening the sense of crisis. Each nation felt the weight of the human cost differently, but all were united in grief. The statistics told one story, but the personal losses told another. Behind every number was a son, father, or brother who would never return. The psychological toll on survivors cannot be understated. Men who had fought in the Java Sea described feelings of helplessness as overwhelming, knowing they faced an enemy with superior weapons and numbers. Survivors' guilt plagued many, as those who lived struggled with the memory of shipmates left behind. Nightmares of explosions, screams, and sinking ships haunted them long after the war ended. Some found it impossible to speak of their experiences, locking away the trauma for decades. Others became active storytellers, determined that the sacrifices of their comrades should not be forgotten. Families often noted how these men were never the same again, quieter, withdrawn, and carrying invisible wounds. For many, the battle had shattered not only ships, but also their sense of security and identity. Even in peacetime, echoes of the Java Sea followed them, shaping their lives and legacies. The cost was not only measured in bodies, but in broken spirits. The war's shadow stretched long after the guns fell silent. Cultural memory of the battle also played a role in how the human cost was remembered. In Australia, the anniversary of HMAS Perth's sinking became a solemn day of reflection, honouring the men who perished in distant waters. In the United States, memorial services for USS Houston were held by veterans groups, ensuring the ship's story endured. The Netherlands honoured Admiral Doorman and the Dutch sailors who gave their lives in a doomed but valiant defence. For Britain, the Java Sea campaign became a sobering reminder of imperial decline, yet also of courage under impossible odds. Japanese records, meanwhile, rarely acknowledged the suffering of Allied sailors, focusing instead on their own victory. Yet even in Japan, some veterans later reflected on the humanity of their foes, acknowledging the bravery of men who fought until the end. In this way, the human cost transcended borders, reminding both sides of the shared burden of war. Memory became a form of justice for those who never returned. The legacy of the Java Sea was written in sacrifice. Ultimately, the human cost of the Battle of the Java Sea was a tragedy of epic proportions, one that extended far beyond the battlefield. It was seen in the shattered families who received no remains to bury, only the knowledge that their loved ones were lost at sea. It was carried in the suffering of prisoners of war, who endured years of torment before liberation. It was felt in the silence of survivors, who could not bring themselves to speak of what they had witnessed. The battle demonstrated not only the brutality of naval warfare, but also the resilience of those who endured it. While ships could be rebuilt and fleets replaced, the human losses could never be recovered. These sacrifices, though devastating, became part of the larger story of Allied perseverance in the Pacific. The men of the Java Sea paid the highest price so that others could regroup and fight again. Their suffering was immense, but their courage was enduring. In the end, the battle was remembered not just for its defeat, but for the human cost that gave it meaning. The outcome of the Battle of the Java Sea sealed the fate of the Dutch East Indies, marking the collapse of the last significant Allied naval presence in the region. With the Allied fleet shattered and scattered, the Japanese Navy held complete control over the waters surrounding Java. The defeat left the island exposed, its defenses weakened, and its population vulnerable to invasion. For the Japanese, the path to their prized objective, Java with its vast oil and resource wealth, was finally open. The Dutch had fought with determination, but their fleet was too small and too outdated to withstand the modern might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The British and American ships that survived the initial clashes were forced into desperate retreats, unable to regroup for another fight. Japan, emboldened by their naval triumph, swiftly organized invasion convoys to deliver their troops to Java's shores. The island, once considered the linchpin of Allied defense in the South Pacific, now faced imminent occupation. The fall of Java was not just military defeat, it was a turning point in the Pacific War's first phase. The Japanese invasion of Java began almost immediately after their naval victory, demonstrating their relentless momentum. Amphibious landings were executed with precision, supported by naval bombardments and overwhelming air superiority. Japanese troops came ashore at multiple points, including Merrick and Eriton-Witan, exploiting the lack of coordinated Allied resistance. Local defenders, including Dutch colonial troops and small numbers of Australian and British reinforcements, fought bravely but were quickly overwhelmed. The Japanese moved swiftly inland, their mechanized units cutting across Java's roads and railways with little opposition. Resistance collapsed, not because of lack of courage, but because of sheer disparity in numbers and equipment. Japanese bombers and fighters dominated the skies, neutralizing Allied positions before they could mount counterattacks. Cities and ports fell one after another, leaving no strongholds for defenders to rally. The speed of the Japanese advance shocked even the Allies, who had expected at least a prolonged battle. Instead, the conquest of Java unfolded with ruthless efficiency. The Dutch East Indies had long been regarded as an essential source of raw materials, and Java represented its crown jewel. With the island under Japanese control, oil, rubber, and vital minerals would flow to fuel the Japanese war machine. The Dutch colonial administration, already weakened by months of Japanese advances, was powerless to stop the takeover. Civil authorities attempted to maintain order, but the chaos of invasion disrupted every aspect of daily life. Civilians fled in panic as Japanese forces approached, uncertain of what their fate would be under occupation. Rumors of Japanese brutality spread quickly, fueled by reports from conquered territories in Malaya and Singapore. Fear and uncertainty gripped the population as Dutch officials themselves began to evacuate or surrender. For the Japanese, the acquisition of Java was not just strategic but symbolic, proof of their ability to dismantle Western colonial power in Asia. The fall of Java was celebrated in Tokyo as a triumph of the empire's destiny. Yet for the people of Java, it marked the beginning of years of hardship. The Allied military situation on land was equally dire, with fragmented forces unable to present a unified defense. Dutch colonial units, known as the KNIL Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, were scattered across the island, poorly equipped and demoralized. British and Australian reinforcements, though courageous, were too few in number to alter the balance. American units provided additional manpower, but faced the same challenges of coordination and supply. Language barriers, different doctrines, and conflicting chains of command all undermined efforts to mount an effective resistance. The Japanese, by contrast, operated with unified leadership and clear objectives, allowing them to outmaneuver and overwhelm defenders. Battles were fought, but they were brief, often ending in swift Japanese victories. Key strongholds crumbled, leaving defenders isolated and cut off. Without naval or air support, Allied troops could only delay the inevitable. The collapse of Java's defense was a foregone conclusion once the seas belonged to Japan. Admiral Doorman's death in the Java Sea symbolized not only the loss of a leader, but also the collapse of hope for defending the island. His final order, "I am attacking, follow me," remained etched in memory, but it also left Allied forces without centralized command. Subsequent naval actions, such as the battles of Sunda Strait and the Second Java Sea Clash, annihilated the remaining Allied warships. By early March 1942, the once proud ABDA command had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Allied survivors who escaped did so only by fleeing southward toward Australia or westward toward India. Those who remained faced capture, imprisonment, or death at the hands of the Japanese. For the local Dutch leadership, surrender became the only viable option. On March 8, 1942, the Dutch formally capitulated to the Japanese, marking the official fall of Java. The surrender shocked the world, demonstrating how quickly Japan could dismantle colonial powers in Asia. The consequences were both immediate and far-reaching. The fall of Java also had profound consequences for the civilian population. Thousands of Dutch civilians were rounded up and interned in camps, where they faced harsh treatment and privation under Japanese rule. Indonesian civilians, initially hopeful that Japanese occupation might bring liberation from colonialism, soon discovered the reality of exploitation. Forced labor programs, requisition of resources, and brutal military control replaced the old colonial system with an even harsher regime. Families were torn apart as men were taken for labor, women subjected to abuse, and children left in destitution. Hunger and disease became rampant as food supplies were diverted to the Japanese military. Daily life under occupation was defined by fear, uncertainty, and constant surveillance. Those suspected of loyalty to the Dutch or of subversive activity faced imprisonment or execution. The dream of independence was temporarily co-opted by the Japanese, who promised freedom while delivering oppression. The occupation of Java was a human tragedy as much as it was a military defeat. For the Allies, the fall of Java marked the end of their ability to contest Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia. With the Dutch East Indies firmly in Japanese hands, vital resources now sustained the imperial war effort for years to come. Australia found itself exposed, with Japanese forces positioned dangerously close to its northern approaches. The United States, reeling from successive defeats, recognized the need to regroup and shift strategy toward a long-term campaign of attrition. Britain, already strained in Europe and Africa, could offer little immediate assistance to Southeast Asia. The Japanese had achieved one of their primary war goals, the creation of a self-sufficient empire insulated from Allied blockades. Yet even in this moment of triumph, cracks were beginning to form. The rapid expansion stretched Japanese supply lines, and their victories created new enemies determined to fight back. The fall of Java was devastating, but it was also the prelude to the next phase of the war. In time, the tide would turn against Japan. The fall of Java must be understood not just as a military conquest, but as a pivotal moment in the Pacific War's larger narrative. It demonstrated the vulnerability of Western empires in Asia and the effectiveness of Japanese strategy during the war's opening months. It also revealed the cost of inadequate preparation, poor coordination, and underestimation of the enemy. For the people of Java, the occupation brought years of hardship, suffering, and disillusionment under Japanese control. For the Allies, it forced a re-evaluation of how to confront Japan, eventually leading to strategies that emphasized carrier warfare, long-range bombing, and island-hopping campaigns. The defeat at Java served as both a warning and a lesson, shaping Allied determination to regroup and strike back. Yet for the men who fought there, the memory was one of sacrifice and loss, a doomed but courageous defense against overwhelming odds. The fall of Java closed one chapter of the war while opening another. In its aftermath, the Pacific conflict entered a new and decisive stage. The Battle of the Java Sea exposed in brutal clarity the weaknesses of the Allied coalition in early 1942. The ABDA command, though a symbol of unity, was plagued by cultural, linguistic, and doctrinal divisions that crippled its effectiveness. Orders were often delayed or misunderstood as Dutch, British, American, and Australian crews struggled to coordinate under fire. Admiral Doorman, though brave, lacked the means to synchronize his fleet in the chaos of battle. Radios were unreliable, signals were misinterpreted, and the fog of war only compounded the confusion. Japanese forces, by contrast, operated with precise coordination, benefiting from years of drilled tactics and unified command structures. The Allies were forced into reactive maneuvers, unable to implement a coherent strategy. Ships often acted independently rather than as a coordinated strike group. This lack of cohesion ensured that even moments of bravery failed to alter the battle's course. The Java Sea was, above all, a tragedy of disunity. Communication breakdowns were a central factor in the Allied defeat, highlighting the limitations of multinational command. The ABDA fleet contained ships from 4 nations, each with its own communication systems, codes, and procedures. Simple signals such as course changes or attack orders were frequently misunderstood in the heat of combat. American destroyers sometimes failed to receive instructions that Dutch cruisers had already acted upon. British and Dutch crews, unfamiliar with American tactical doctrines, misinterpreted maneuvers that were standard in US practice. This created dangerous gaps in the battle line, allowing Japanese ships to exploit weaknesses with devastating effect. The Allies were also at a disadvantage because their radios were less powerful and often drowned out by Japanese jamming or natural interference. By contrast, Japanese commanders maintained effective fleet-wide communication, enabling them to concentrate fire and coordinate torpedo spreads. The Allied fleet's inability to speak with one voice sealed its fate. Miscommunication was not merely a weakness, it was fatal. Inferior training and preparation further contributed to the imbalance between Allied and Japanese forces. Many of the Allied crews in the Java Sea were newly assembled, with little chance to practice maneuvers together. Dutch ships, though seasoned, were often manned by inexperienced conscripts and colonial sailors with limited combat exposure. American units still recovering from Pearl Harbor were brave but untested in large-scale surface engagements. The Japanese Navy, however, was a veteran force trained extensively in night fighting, torpedo tactics, and fleet coordination. Their officers and men had rehearsed complex maneuvers countless times before the war, giving them confidence under fire. Japanese gunnery was more accurate, their torpedo spreads more deadly, and their pilots more experienced. The Allies, despite courage, could not compensate for this disparity in professionalism. The battle revealed that war is won not just by numbers but by preparation and skill. At Java Sea, Japan's superiority in training overwhelmed Allied determination. Another decisive factor was the Allies' inferiority in equipment and technology. Japanese warships carried the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, a weapon far superior to anything in the Allied arsenal. Its extraordinary range, accuracy, and explosive power devastated Allied formations, often before enemy ships even detected the incoming threat. Allied torpedoes, by contrast, were plagued with malfunctions, duds, and short ranges that limited their effectiveness. Japanese cruisers and destroyers also carried heavier armaments and enjoyed superior speed compared to many Allied vessels. Air cover, which could have balanced the odds, was almost non-existent for the Allies. Japanese reconnaissance planes circled above, providing constant intelligence on Allied movements. Allied ships entered battle at a material disadvantage, with outdated vessels facing cutting-edge technology. The imbalance was not just tactical, but technological. Japan's investment in naval weaponry before the war paid off decisively in the waters of the Java Sea. The lack of air support for the Allied fleet was perhaps the most glaring weakness of the campaign. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, aircraft had already proven their importance at Pearl Harbor and in Malaya, yet the ABDA fleet entered the Java Sea with minimal carrier presence and virtually no long-range air reconnaissance. Japanese bombers and fighters roamed the skies freely, spotting Allied ships and relaying their positions to surface commanders. This constant surveillance allowed the Japanese Navy to dictate the pace and location of the engagement. Allied ships, meanwhile, sailed blind, with little knowledge of enemy strength or positioning until shells and torpedoes struck. Without aircraft to scout or defend, the Allied fleet was perpetually on the back foot. The Java Sea confirmed that naval warfare in World War II could no longer be fought successfully without air superiority. The Allies paid the price for fighting with 20th century ships, but 19th century doctrines. The human element of the battle also revealed stark contrasts between the two sides. Allied crews displayed remarkable courage, launching attacks even when outgunned and outnumbered. Destroyer crews charged Japanese lines in desperate torpedo runs, knowing their chances of survival were slim. Cruisers like HMS Exeter and Deruta fought valiantly until they were crippled or sunk. Yet bravery alone could not offset the Japanese advantage in discipline and tactical execution. Japanese sailors, drilled in aggressive offensive tactics, executed complex maneuvers with calm precision. Their commanders exploited every Allied mistake, turning small advantages into decisive blows. Allied sailors, despite their valor, were often left demoralized as they saw one ship after another go down. Leadership was brave but often overwhelmed, unable to adapt to Japanese superiority. The courage of individuals could not overcome the systemic weaknesses of the Allied fleet. At Java Sea, the human spirit clashed with hard reality, and reality prevailed. Another lesson of the battle was the futility of fighting without a coherent strategic objective. The ABDA command was formed hastily, intended to stem Japan's tide, but lacked a unified vision for how to win. Admiral Doorman's orders emphasized attacking the enemy, but without clear coordination or achievable goals. These became suicidal gestures rather than effective strategy. The Japanese, by contrast, fought with a clear purpose to eliminate Allied naval resistance and secure Java for invasion. Every move they made was linked to this larger objective, allowing them to fight with consistency and focus. The Allies, by contrast, were reacting to events rather than shaping them. Ships sailed into battle already disadvantaged, guided more by desperation than by strategy. This lack of coherent planning magnified every mistake and minimized every success. In the end, the Allies were not defeated merely at sea, but at the level of strategic conception. The Java Sea revealed the cost of entering war without a plan. The Battle of the Java Sea offered harsh but invaluable lessons that would shape the future of Allied strategy in the Pacific. It underscored the necessity of air power, the importance of communication, and the fatal consequences of underestimating Japanese naval skill. It highlighted the dangers of multinational coalitions that lack proper coordination and unified command structures. It demonstrated the devastating power of Japanese technology, from long-lance torpedoes to disciplined night-fighting tactics. And most importantly, it revealed that courage alone cannot win battles against a superior, well-prepared enemy. These lessons, learned through blood and sacrifice, would not be forgotten. In later battles like Midway and Guadalcanal, the Allies applied these lessons, turning disaster into eventual victory. The Java Sea was not just a defeat, it was a crucible of learning. From its failures emerged the strategies that would eventually bring Japan's downfall. The memory of the Battle of the Java Sea has lived on as both a symbol of sacrifice and a reminder of the cost of unpreparedness. In the Netherlands, the battle became one of the defining tragedies of the war, remembered as the moment when Dutch naval power was extinguished in its ancestral waters. Admiral Karel Doorman's final command, "Ik val volg me," I am attacking, follow me, entered Dutch national memory as a phrase of courage and defiance. Dutch survivors, few in number, carried the weight of defeat alongside pride in their comrades' bravery. In Australia, the battle symbolized the danger of Japanese expansion and the vulnerability of the continent itself. Australians remembered the Java Sea as part of the larger struggle to defend their homeland, fought with allies but at immense cost. In Britain, the battle was absorbed into the long narrative of early setbacks in the Far East, grouped alongside Singapore and Malaya as examples of the empire's decline. Yet British sailors who fought in the Java Sea were honored for their sacrifice in impossible circumstances. In America, the battle was less prominent than Pearl Harbor or Midway, but remembered among naval circles as a painful lesson. Across all nations, memory of the Java Sea was tied not only to defeat, but to the spirit of endurance. In the Netherlands, the loss of Admiral Doorman and his flagship De Ruyter became a central focus of remembrance. Doorman was elevated to the status of a national hero, his name inscribed in memorials and streets across Dutch cities. His decision to press the attack, even in the face of overwhelming Japanese superiority, was remembered as an act of duty rather than folly. Dutch naval veterans spoke of him as a man who embodied honor, sacrifice, and resistance to tyranny. The wrecks of Dutch ships lying in the Java Sea became underwater graves, silently testifying to the sacrifice of Dutch sailors. Families of the lost sailors found some measure of comfort in the national recognition of their loved ones. Dutch schoolchildren in the post-war era were taught about the battle as part of their country's wartime suffering and defiance. The battle thus became part of the Netherlands' collective memory of occupation, loss, and eventual liberation. It was not merely a naval defeat. It was a symbol of Dutch resilience. Doorman's legacy endured long after the guns fell silent. In Australia, the battle resonated as a stark warning of the Japanese threat creeping southward. The fall of Java after the battle placed Australia within striking distance of Japanese bombers and invasion forces. For Australians, the sacrifice of their sailors in the Java Sea was remembered as part of the wider defence of the homeland. The Australian cruiser HMAS Perth, lost shortly after in the Sunda Strait, became a powerful symbol of this sacrifice. Australian survivors who returned told stories of desperation, bravery, and brotherhood in the face of defeat. These accounts entered Australian war memory as part of the nation's growing awareness of its independent role in the Pacific War. Memorials in Sydney, Melbourne, and Canberra paid tribute to those who died far from home. The Java Sea was remembered not simply as a defeat, but as a contribution to a collective Allied struggle. For many Australians, it highlighted the price of standing shoulder to shoulder with allies in defence of freedom. The memory of the battle became tied to Australia's evolving identity as a nation forged in war. In Britain, the memory of the Java Sea was overshadowed by other losses in the Far East, yet it retained symbolic significance. The destruction of British ships, like HMS Exeter, represented the decline of imperial prestige in Asia. For British veterans, the battle became a reminder of courage and adversity, fought against overwhelming odds with honour intact. Memorials in Portsmouth and London include the names of those who perished in the Java Sea. The battle was remembered within the Royal Navy as an example of the perils of entering battle without air cover or sufficient coordination. British historians often linked the Java Sea with the fall of Singapore and the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse. Together, these events marked the collapse of British naval dominance in Asia. Yet the bravery of British sailors was never forgotten, honoured in regimental histories and veteran associations. Families of the fallen kept alive the memory of loved ones lost so far from home. The Java Sea thus entered British memory as both tragedy and testament. In America, the battle was remembered more as a lesson than as a national tragedy. American ships, like U.S. Houston, and 4 destroyers fought bravely, but their sacrifice was folded into the broader narrative of the Pacific War. Naval strategists studied the Java Sea carefully, analyzing every mistake, from poor communication to the devastating impact of Japanese torpedoes. For many in the U.S. Navy, the battle was a crucible of hard truths that would shape future victories at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. The bravery of American crews was honored in naval traditions, with Houston in particular becoming a symbol of sacrifice. Survivors of Houston and other ships carried their memories into prisoner of war camps, where their suffering became part of the wider story of endurance. In memorial services across the United States, the Java Sea was recalled as part of the early sacrifices made to halt Japan. Families of the lost were honored with medals and recognition, though the battle never gained the fame of later triumphs. Yet within naval circles, the Java Sea remained a point of study and remembrance. It was remembered not for glory, but for the lessons carved into its legacy. The symbolic meaning of the ABDA fleet sacrifice has been a unifying theme across nations. Though they were defeated, the multinational crews fought together in the face of overwhelming odds. Dutch, British, American, and Australian sailors shared the same seas, the same dangers, and the same fate. The memory of their cooperation, though marred by failure, became a symbol of Allied unity. It demonstrated that even in the darkest days of 1942, nations stood together against tyranny. This symbolism has been preserved in joint memorials and annual commemorations. Veterans groups from different countries have gathered to remember the fallen as brothers in arms rather than separate national losses. The ABDA fleet's sacrifice showed the world the price of coalition warfare, but also its spirit. In later decades, remembrance ceremonies often emphasized unity over defeat. The Java Sea thus came to represent not only tragedy, but the ideal of solidarity. The wrecks of ships at the bottom of the Java Sea remain powerful sites of memory. For decades, these underwater graves lay undisturbed, visited only by fishermen and local divers. In recent years, however, concerns over illegal salvaging have drawn attention to the need for preservation. Governments and veterans organizations have sought to protect the wrecks as war graves. For the families of the lost, these wrecks are sacred places where their loved ones rest. Commemorations at sea have seen wreaths cast into the waters above, connecting memory to the physical remnants of battle. The silent hulks of Exeter, Deruta, and Houston tell their own story, one of sacrifice in distant waters. Maritime archaeology has uncovered artifacts that humanize the battle, from personal belongings to pieces of ship machinery. These relics remind us that behind strategy and tactics were human lives. The wrecks of the Java Sea ensure that memory remains tied to place. The legacy of the Battle of the Java Sea endures as a lesson in both sacrifice and failure. For the nations involved, it remains a reminder of the courage of sailors who fought against impossible odds. For historians, it stands as a case study in the consequences of disunity, poor preparation, and underestimating an enemy. For the families of the fallen, it is a chapter of grief balanced by pride in service. Across the Netherlands, Australia, Britain, and America, the memory of the Java Sea continues to be honored in ceremonies and memorials. The symbolic sacrifice of the ABDA fleet has been reinterpreted as a foundation of Allied unity in the Pacific War. Though the battle was a defeat, its memory was transformed into an enduring legacy of courage. It is remembered not for what was lost, but for the spirit of resistance it embodied. The Java Sea reminds us that even in defeat, sacrifice can carry meaning across generations. Memory, like the sea itself, holds the echoes of those who never returned. The Battle of the Java Sea marked the definitive collapse of Allied naval power in Southeast Asia, a loss from which the region would not recover until years later. In its aftermath, Japan secured control of the Dutch East Indies, ensuring access to oil, rubber, and resources that fueled its war machine. The fall of Java and the destruction of the ABDA fleet left Australia exposed and Southeast Asia firmly under Japanese domination. For the Allies, it was the culmination of a chain of defeats that had begun at Pearl Harbor and swept through Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. The scale of the disaster underscored the fragility of multinational cooperation without clear command structures. Ships from 4 nations had sailed together, but they had perished together without the cohesion needed to prevail. Yet, even in defeat, the battle revealed the bravery of sailors who pressed the attack against superior forces. Admiral Doorman's legacy became not just Dutch, but international, symbolizing courage against impossible odds. The Java Sea thus became both an ending and a beginning. It ended Allied presence in Southeast Asia, but began the long process of learning and adaptation. The destruction of the ABDA fleet forced the Allies to rethink their approach to the Pacific War. Never again would they commit scattered forces piecemeal against the concentrated might of the Japanese Navy. The lesson was stark: without air cover, and without modern torpedoes, surface fleets could not prevail against Japan's highly trained crews and deadly long-lance torpedoes. The defeat highlighted the importance of intelligence, logistics, and unified command, elements that would later define Allied strategy. The costly loss of cruisers and destroyers made clear that bravery alone could not substitute for preparation. Within months, the Allies began to reorganize their Pacific war effort under a more centralized command, reducing the fragmentation that had doomed ABDA. The United States, with its industrial might, gradually assumed leadership of naval operations, shifting the balance. Australia, once threatened, became a vital base for counteroffensives. The Java Sea was a tragedy, but its lessons helped forge future victories. Its memory became a cautionary tale etched into Allied naval doctrine. For Japan, the victory in the Java Sea represented the peak of its naval dominance. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies completed the empire's defensive perimeter and ensured vital oil supplies. Japanese naval commanders celebrated the destruction of Allied resistance, confident that the balance of power had swung permanently in their favor. Yet this triumph also carried within it seeds of overconfidence. By crushing ABDA so decisively, Japan underestimated the long-term capacity of the Allies to rebuild. The battle reinforced the belief in the superiority of Japanese tactics and weaponry, blinding leaders to the vulnerabilities of their own strategy. While the Java Sea opened the way for Japanese expansion, it also created the illusion of invincibility. In hindsight, it marked not only the height of Japan's power, but the beginning of its gradual decline. For though the Allies were beaten, they were learning, adapting, and preparing. The lessons of the Java Sea would return to haunt Japan in battles yet to come. The human cost of the battle was staggering, with thousands of sailors lost across 4 nations. For families in the Netherlands, Britain, Australia, and the United States, the Java Sea became a graveyard far from home, its wrecks resting as silent tombs beneath the waves. Survivors carried scars of trauma, recalling the terror of exploding shells, burning ships, and desperate abandonments. For many, captivity in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps followed, compounding their suffering. The memory of the fallen was honored in monuments and memorials across nations, but for the survivors, remembrance was personal, etched in the faces of shipmates they would never see again. The Java Sea was not merely a clash of steel, but a human tragedy of immense proportions. This duality, strategic defeat and human sacrifice, ensured that the battle would never be forgotten. It stood as a reminder that behind charts and fleet compositions were real men, living and dying in the fury of battle. Their sacrifice gave the battle meaning beyond its tactical outcome. Memory transformed tragedy into legacy. In the broader scope of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Java Sea signaled the end of Japan's meteoric advance and the threshold of Allied resurgence. Though the Allies had lost the battle, the experience hardened them for what was to come. Within weeks, the United States would halt Japan at Coral Sea, and within months it would achieve a decisive victory at Midway. The Java Sea had shown the cost of unpreparedness. Coral Sea and Midway would show the fruits of adaptation. The loss of experienced sailors and ships was immense, but their sacrifice bought time, delaying Japan's timetable for expansion. This delay allowed the Allies to strengthen positions in Australia and the South Pacific. The road from defeat to victory was neither straight nor certain, but the Java Sea was a turning point. It marked the last great triumph of Japanese unchecked expansion. From this point onward, the tide, though slow, began to turn. History remembers the Java Sea not only for loss, but for its place in the larger arc of Allied resurgence. The strategic lessons of the Java Sea influenced naval doctrine for decades. The battle highlighted the supremacy of air power over surface fleets, a lesson reinforced in every subsequent Pacific engagement. It demonstrated the necessity of unified command and clear communication, principles that would shape the creation of modern joint operations. The devastating effectiveness of Japanese long-lance torpedoes forced the Allies to improve their own weapons and tactics. The bravery of destroyer crews charging into hopeless battles became examples studied in naval academies. For military historians, the Java Sea became a case study in coalition warfare, showing both its potential and its pitfalls. The sacrifices of ABDA were not in vain. They became part of the education of future generations. Doctrines on fleet concentration, reconnaissance and intelligence all trace part of their refinement back to this battle. Though remembered as a defeat, the Java Sea was also a teacher. It taught lessons written in fire and steel. It ensured that mistakes would not be repeated. In the decades after the war, remembrance of the Java Sea became a bridge between nations once divided by language and culture. Annual commemorations brought together Dutch, Australian, British, and American representatives. Memorials at home and in Indonesia honored those who had fallen, with ceremonies held on the waters where the battle was fought. Survivors shared their testimonies, ensuring that the human voice remained central to the story. For the Netherlands, it was a moment of national mourning turned into enduring pride. For Australia, it was a chapter in the defense of the homeland. For Britain, it was a reminder of imperial decline, but also of naval heroism. For America, it was a lesson absorbed into the larger story of the Pacific War. The shared sacrifice of four nations created bonds of memory, stronger than defeat. The Java Sea thus became not only history but heritage. The Battle of the Java Sea concludes our story not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of the larger turning point in the Pacific War. It was the last gasp of Allied defense in Southeast Asia, a desperate struggle fought with courage but doomed by circumstance. Yet from its ashes arose the resolve that carried the Allies to ultimate victory. The men who perished in those waters did not fight in vain, for their sacrifice illuminated the path forward. Their story reminds us that history is shaped as much by defeats as by triumphs. The Java Sea endures as a lesson in unity, strategy, and the human spirit under fire. Its memory lives on in memorials, in scholarship, and in the enduring gratitude of free nations. This was not the end, but the beginning of a long road back. From the depths of loss rose the determination to prevail. The Battle of the Java Sea remains a turning point etched forever in the annals of war.